Now a briefing on Homeland Security financing. Yesterday, congressional staffers and business leaders from the defense and transportation industries spoke to corporate executives on funding and procurement for Homeland Security programs. The group Equity International hosted this 3-hour event.
Homeland Security financing briefing here at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. We welcome the 100 top corporate executives attending today, and we are also pleased to welcome our C-SPAN and other viewers. Last Thursday, October 17th, CIA Director George Tenet told Congress that the threat environment we find ourselves in today is as bad as it was in the summer of 2001, just before 9/11. Speaking about al-Qaeda, Tenet said, quote, "They are reconstituted, they are coming after us, they are planning in multi-theaters, they are planning to strike the homeland again," unquote. That is why President Bush has requested $3.5 billion for first responders such as firefighters and rescue workers, $5.9 billion in bioterrorism response and research, $4.8 billion for the Transportation Security Administration, $406 million for Coast Guard port security patrols, $1.3 billion for the National Institutes of Health, and much more funding for other types of programs designed to secure the homeland. That is why America's best companies and those of allied countries are attending this briefing today. Such corporations as ABT Associates, ADI Technologies, Acquient, Agilent Technologies, American Management Systems, Andurillus Corporation, Antion, Arinc, Atlantic Systems, Autodesk, Avaya, BAE Systems, BindView, Booz Allen Hamilton, Boeing, Dayton T. Brown, C2 Technologies, CACI, Calibre Systems, Compliant, Cryptech, Davis Page Management Systems, Dell Computer, Delphi, Delta Airlines, Desafios, DynCorp, Dynetics, EagleCheck, Eastman Kodak, EER Group, Excel International, Focus Enterprises, General Atomics, General Dynamics, Hannon Armstrong, High Point Aviation, Hitachi America, ICF Consulting, Intijet Corporation, Keene Federal Systems, Linnell Systems, Lockheed Martin, Llewellyn Security, Luna Innovations, Motorola, Network Appliance, Northrop Grumman, Oracle, Panasonic, Permastore, Pinkerton Government Services, Raytheon, Robbins Goa, SAIC, the Spectrum Group, TEK Systems, Tellabs, Titan, TRW, the VIA Group, and Verizon. Also attending are the Naval Undersea Warfare Center and the City of Austin, Texas. And the threat that CIA Director Tenet described last week, which is why my firm, Equity International, is organizing and hosting the Homeland Security Financing Briefing Series. Our goal is to speed up the process of securing the homeland by introducing companies with Homeland Security applications to the government agencies needing them, identify the financing available to make it all happen, and publicize the opportunities, agencies, and companies through the news media. Our briefings in June, July, and August provided the latest congressional budget information on Homeland Security funding, identified Homeland Security programs and procurement procedures in such agencies as Defense, Justice, and FBI, and featured keynote addresses by such top government officials as Mark Holman, Deputy Assistant to the President for Homeland Security, and Dale Watson, Executive Assistant FBI Director in charge of counterterrorism. Please mark your calendars for our future briefings. Our briefing on November 18th will feature the latest information on Homeland Security programs and funding, with a particular emphasis on bioterrorism, health security, and food security. Our briefing on December 16th will feature the latest information on Homeland Security programs and funding, with a particular emphasis on first responders and Homeland Security at the state and local levels. Next March 3rd through 5th, 2003, Equity International is pleased to bring you the Homeland and Global Security Summit to be held at the Washington Convention Center here in Washington, D.C. The summit is the premier global forum in 2003 on Homeland and Global Security, featuring 6 general sessions on everything from Department of Defense programs to IT and network security applications, numerous breakout sessions on agency funding and procurement procedures, and the exhibits of the best companies in America and abroad featuring Homeland Security applications. To find out more information about the briefings and the summit, as well as the latest information on Homeland Security, please visit our online Center for Homeland and Global Security at www.globalsecurity.bz, boy zebra, or call us at 202-756-2244. We have an outstanding program for you this morning, comprised of leading government and corporate leaders, providing you with the latest information on Homeland Security financing and programs. And we are honored to have as our keynote speaker Robert Gardner, the Chief Financial Officer of the Transportation Security Administration. We are also very pleased to have the support of the Homeland Security Industries Association, the leading association for companies with Homeland Security applications. Here to provide welcoming remarks is the association's chairman, Bruce DeGrazia, who is also vice president of Versar, Inc. Bruce?
Thank you, Bill, and good morning to all of you. As Bill said, I am the chair of the Homeland Security Industries Association, which he compliments us by saying we're the leading trade organization in the Homeland Security field. One of the reasons that we're the leading organization in this field is because we're the only one. Back about 2-3 months ago, Bruce Aitken, who's the president of the organization, and I were discussing our clients and the necessity for them to work together to understand what is this new and burgeoning field of Homeland Security. And we both knew, having been in Washington for a number of years, how important it was to have a trade association to which our clients could belong so that they could network, they could understand the issues, they could track congressional legislation and executive legislation, and to generally get a better idea in a group of what was out there than they could have by themselves. So we confidently went out there to find the trade association for our clients, and it wasn't there. There was nothing available. And so, given our background, our experience, and the fact that we lived in Washington, we decided to form one. Hence, we have the Homeland Security Industries Association, which has now just started. We rolled it out about a month ago, and we have had tremendous response. Again, because we have filled a void that had not been filled before. Essentially, the organization, and since I only have 5 minutes, I want to very briefly go over the 4 aspects of the organization and concentrate on one. The organization has 4 different segments. First is we have a number of task groups, each of which has a focus on a particular area of Homeland Security. Bioterrorism issues, port security, airport security. Essentially, the reason that we decided to have these when we started out was because we needed to stand for something. There is nothing more common in Washington, D.C. than groups of professionals that have lunch clubs and don't stand for something. They're wonderful, but that's not what we were about. And therefore, we decided that we needed to have these task groups so that we could put together positions and position papers of where we stood, which would form the basis for the way the organization was going to concentrate and act in its dealings with Congress and with other business and with the government generally. We also do congressional regulatory tracking. There are some huge number, over 50 committees and subcommittees of Congress that deal with the Homeland Security issue. And it is impossible for companies, even if they have government affairs organizations, to track everything that's going on. Third, one of the things that we do is we have the commonly known networking part of the organization. This type of field, this field of Homeland Security, is increasingly being driven by government contracting, but also is very specialized. You have a large number of organizations that concentrate on one aspect of Homeland Security. And yet what you also have are very wide open and large government contract requests. And even the largest of companies cannot find it economic to be able to have all of the aspects of Homeland Security within that company. Therefore, one of the things that we have been trying to do is bring companies together and therefore find ourselves in a position, and for them to find themselves in a position where they can bring together teams to bid on contracts. And this brings me to the last part of what the organization stands for. What we are planning to do, and what we are already doing, is tracking bids for Homeland Security contracts and requests for proposals across the country. If you are a sophisticated company, you know how to go to FedBizOpps and find most, but not all, of the requests for proposals that the federal government does. I say most, but not all, because those companies here today that do a lot of federal business know that there's a lot of sole source stuff out there that you don't know about by reading FedBizOpps. The other thing, though, that you have to recognize, and which I think we all do recognize, is simply that whatever your sophistication level is, and whatever your relationship with the federal government, it's not going to help you with the 11 different departments in the state of New Jersey that deal with Homeland Security, to say nothing of the 50 states that also have departments that deal with Homeland Security and have contracts for Homeland Security. We track those. We get them first, and we give them to our members. We are also reaching out to look at counties and municipalities, because they are going to be increasingly driven by to give contracts out themselves. It's not going to be just from the states and from the federal government. So that, in essence, is what the Homeland Security Industries Association does and what it stands for. It stands for its members. And I welcome you all to talk to me later, to talk about joining the organization. We are moving very quickly. We are gathering a lot of members, and I think that this is going to be very, very helpful to the Homeland Security business. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. There is more information about the Homeland Security Industries Association in your packet. Our first session this morning is a powerful panel on Homeland Security spending by the U.S. federal government. We are fortunate to have as our moderator Greg Pellegrino, a partner with Deloitte Consulting in Boston and the leader of Deloitte Consulting's global e-government practice. He is an expert at helping government organizations improve performance and service through the use of innovative technologies. Earlier this year, Greg was called upon by the leadership of the Transportation Security Administration to help lead their e-government program as part of their effort to integrate the objectives of the President's management agenda with their fulfillment of the Aviation and Transportation Security Act of 2001. Greg has advised government executives in many of the world's largest governments on new business strategies for meeting the increased expectations of government to deliver results to constituents. Mr. Pellegrino has over 16 years of experience in strategic planning, program management, and systems implementation in the public sector. As one of Deloitte Consulting's global leaders, Greg provides planning, management, and oversight assistance to Deloitte Consulting professionals and client projects in the Americas, Europe, and the Asia-Pacific Africa regions. Greg, welcome.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everybody. Thought I'd take a few minutes just to acknowledge Congress and congratulate Secretary Mineta and Admiral Loy, Undersecretary of the Transportation Security Administration, for establishing last week the baseline for TSA's budget for fiscal year 2003 at $5.1 billion in the continuing resolution. It was the right thing to do. It was an essential step towards assuring that TSA can continue to make progress towards fulfilling the mandates of the Aviation Transportation Security Act of 2001. This is a challenging period for all of us, an imperfect storm of economic difficulty amidst the need for greater homeland security and protection of freedom of movement and the freedom of commerce in our country. We must recognize that this is a new environment in which we live. This isn't a single solution or a single transaction that we'll be a part of. It is a necessary portfolio of investments, activities, and that the U.S. government must lead in conjunction with the people in this room, other government leaders as well as business partners. John asked me to introduce today's session, so it's important to set the stage for what we are talking about today. Earlier this month, President Bush published the strategy for securing the homeland and strengthening the nation. This plan provides the budget for the priorities for the administration while the future creation of the Department of Homeland Security is debated on Capitol Hill. These priorities include an increased focus on first responders at the state and local government level, our borders, the threat of bioterrorism, information sharing, and a new citizen corps to help prepare our communities for a terrorist attack. But just as the threat of terrorism is the environment in which we live, the threat of incumbency and complacency is an equal challenge for government leaders to overcome, as well as those of us in business and industry in this room. The folklore, motherhood, and the "we haven't done it that way before" must yield and make way for new ideas and eliminate the barriers to coordination, collaboration, and achieving real results. It's been suggested that the economic impact of September 11th and the war on terrorism has had as much as a 5% negative impact on our gross domestic product in 2003. Though this seems reasonable, what is less understood is how the investment in Homeland Security will provide for economic growth beyond the consultants and the media here today in this room. And so it's important to acknowledge here that Homeland Security and this investment is at the center of nearly all of our economic activity. Its relationship to consumer confidence, the ability to move freely, the reduction of barriers to trade in and out of our borders, and our ability to respond and recover in the event of an attack are clear. What is less clear is how the investments in Homeland Security will pay off. And as I said, Homeland Security is the new condition. It's the constraint to returning to the economic growth that we've become accustomed to for the past decade. And believe it or not, there are precedents to this level of investment and the resulting economic success. And let me read you a brief quote. "Our unity as a nation is sustained by free communication of thought and by easy transportation of people and goods. The united forces of our communication and transportation systems are dynamic elements in the very name we bear, the United States. Without them, we would be a mere alliance of many separate parts." And though those words could have been spoken last week, they in fact were said by President Eisenhower nearly 50 years ago in the State of the Union address, where he described the vision for a national interstate and defense system. This was to be the bricks and mortar equivalent of today's investment in Homeland Security. And to put this budget into context, that system at the time, the National Highway System, was projected to cost $44 billion then, an amount that today would be more than $250 billion when compared against the gross domestic product of the country. And that would put today's investment in Homeland Security as a mere down payment on our country's economic future. The interstate defense system, whose origin was based on the German system of superhighways used for the military, is regarded now as one of the greatest economic investments ever made in the history of the world. And while the nation's concrete highways were the past equivalent to today's digital highways that carry information and commerce in the 21st century, it's important for us to reflect a bit on the history of making these types of investments and stepping up to new models for doing business. Let me break down a little bit of the budget for you. It should come as no surprise when you see that the greatest growth areas of investment in Homeland Security is in the area of digital technology and information sharing. We must be successful in breaking down the information barriers between government agencies at the federal, state, and local levels, as well as bring new business into the fold. This is a major upgrade of our nation's systems and infrastructure at the federal, state, and local level. It's also clear that this is a war that will be waged locally. The greatest percentage increase investment comes in the funding for the nation's federal, state, and local resources that are on the front lines of securing our homeland. One only needed to be in Washington the past several weeks to see the relationship of our transportation systems to that of the threat of terror. The incredible skills and involvement that local law enforcement officials here have shown in light of the sniper attacks and the terror threats certainly make it clear that the justification for increased investment at the local level is vital to success in Homeland Security. I saw firsthand the rapid response of state, local, and federal officials following the sniper shooting in Falls Church just last week. And that rapid response highlights the role that the country's transportation systems play, as well as the role of all members of the law enforcement and safety community working together. And to put this into perspective, I've highlighted TSA here in this slide, just simply because of the volume of responsibility and transactions and commerce that they have. 700 million air travelers per year will pass through TSA's security screening. Over 30 million pieces of luggage every day. 7.5 million containers, 11 million trucks on the road, 2.2 million rail cars, and over 9 billion commuter rail trips each year. Our economic success depends on the funding and execution of TSA and Homeland Security. And so while we've talked this morning about the investment and the rationale for this level of spending on Homeland Security, one question is, what should government do to ensure that our citizens and communities get their money's worth and the results are in fact achieved? I'll share with you 3 imperatives and 1 comment on the proposed Department of Homeland Security. First, the President's plan for Homeland Security represents an enterprise approach to achieving the objectives of this administration. This approach is similar to what we would advise any of the world's largest corporations and largest governments. Becoming more integrated and eliminating self-interests and protective behavior, becoming more collaborative and stripping down the barriers between organizations and information, becoming strategic in thinking and less beholden to the ways things used to be, and finally becoming more results-oriented. And this is where the President's management agenda has it right. Government is good at creating programs, but doesn't focus enough on getting the results that they set out to achieve. I think things are changing here, and I think that the increased emphasis on results and cooperation are clear. And 2 other things must happen to achieve results from the investment in Homeland Security. Take advantage of the enterprise strategy that's been formed to transform the business by defining a new business model, the measures of success, the blueprints for achieving those successes, and get on with the execution. Let the strategy drive the priorities and make sure that the tools support the objectives. 2, focus more on the extended Homeland Security enterprise. They were mentioned earlier by Bruce, the fact that a lot of the investment that will be made will be raising the level of capabilities outside of Washington in the states and in the local communities. The funding commitment to first responders is a positive step, but true empowerment will require stronger partnerships with state and local government as well as industry. For example, it's impossible to expect success in air transportation security without greater collaboration and funding for the airlines themselves. We should expect them to meet us in the middle of the new standards and expectations and acknowledge the costs and impact of the new way of doing business. Likewise, we cannot expect to have accurate identification information at the state level without resources to modernize the record-keeping systems currently in operation in the states. The airlines in the states are an example of how Homeland Security effectiveness will be measured by how it creates the extended enterprise of intelligence gathering, information sharing, and first response. And finally, a few words about the proposed Department of Homeland Security. This is the right thing to do today. If it doesn't happen, then one reason is that it has become such a foregone conclusion that the cooperation among the departments that would join it has taken root amidst the debate on Capitol Hill. It's the role of government to make sure that these functions are performed effectively. Creating such an enterprise will be a challenge. Our experience, some of which shown here, shows that the largest corporate mergers in the world would suggest that merging 22 agencies and 170,000 employees will be quite difficult. However, we believe that there are savings to be achieved and resources that can be redeployed to mission-critical assignments, particularly in the field. We encourage the leaders involved with the formation of the Department of Homeland Security to seek out the best experiences of other government and their commercial counterparts to achieve the promise of the future department. Towards the end, we should ask ourselves what the measures are in success of Homeland Security. And they should be that we hired the best people, we prepared them well, we gave them the best tools, and we allowed them to carry out their mission. To the businesses that are here seeking opportunities in Homeland Security, my recommendations are to determine what you do best, better than anybody else, and bring the best people who are good at doing what you do best, and leave the self-interest and proprietary thinking at the door, because this is an environment where cooperation and collaboration is essential by everybody involved. There's a lot of work to do, and the opportunities are tremendous, but the risk of failure or not delivering is too severe for us to make that mistake. I certainly wish you the best luck in your efforts. I want to take a minute to introduce our next speaker on the panel, Rich Mead. Rich is the Chief of Staff for Congressman Jim Nussle of Iowa. He began his service when Jim Nussle was elected chairman in 2001, and since his election he's held many positions with Congressman Nussle, and currently is the Chief of Staff of the House Budget Committee. Rich?
Thank you for having me this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to give you an overview of where we are in Congress. And in order to do that, I like to, when I talk about where we are in Congress, try and put things in perspective. And when you put things in perspective in terms of Homeland Security and transportation security, you really have to go back to September 11th. And you hear, time and time again, politicians who give speeches, and they start with, on September 11th, our world changed, and it did. And the environment in the world on Capitol Hill changed as well. And what we saw on September 11th, and I don't know if my program is available. If it's not, I'll just speak through it. But what we saw on September 11th was Congress came together quickly and in a bipartisan way and responded to those events. And the first thing we did was we provided $40 billion in response to September 11th. $20 billion to clean up here at home and for recovery efforts, and $20 billion to fight the war on terrorism overseas. Most of that money, not all of it, most of that money has already been spent and has been put to use. We also provided $8 billion for the aviation industry. We realized how critical aviation was to our economy and to our nation, and we provided the resources to keep the planes running and keep that system moving. We provided $200 million directly to the victims of terrorism. We provided $75 billion in an economic stimulus package to get the economy moving again. And on that point, we like to say that we had a triple threat that hit us on September 11th. We had the terrorist attacks. First, we had a war overseas against terrorism that we were waging. And third, we had the shock to our economy from those events. And we were in Congress trying to deal with all three of those triple threats at once. And finally, this summer we provided a $23 billion supplemental, wartime supplemental. Some of you may remember that that started out as a $28 billion supplemental on Capitol Hill, $5 billion of which Congress said to the President, if you want to spend 1 penny of that $5 billion, you have to spend it all, and the President opted not to spend 1 penny of it, and so it became a $23 billion supplemental. Now, in fairness, he did turn around and re-request some of the items within that, and I think those are being contemplated in the regular appropriations bills that are moving their way through Congress as we speak. From my perspective on the Budget Committee, this time last year, or heading into November and December of 2001, we were sitting there trying to figure out what in the world we were going to do to put together a budget plan to move forward from September 11th. And we knew that we had new and very pressing needs to secure our nation and protect our homeland and win the war against terrorism. We also knew we had a slow economy we had to get moving, and there are other domestic initiatives that were very important to Congress that we knew we had to put in the forefront of our budget. But we also knew, and we had a hearing about this and had some very distinguished witnesses, including former Speaker Gingrich, former Congressman Hamilton, and the Comptroller General of the GAO, David Walker. And the testimony we took away from that hearing was, you've got new, big, pressing needs, and it's not acceptable for you to take the new needs and layer them on top of all your old needs. As you need to identify and reprioritize within the government to make room for these things. You can't just take that, if you will, if you think of a pie chart, you can't just take that new wedge of spending and just try and fit it into the existing pie. You've got to reprioritize. So we thought we did that with our budget plan. And let me just, and the other key testimony or piece of testimony I took away from that hearing was, and I'll paraphrase David Walker from the GAO on this point, he basically said, as you go forward and budgeting and planning for this, be careful of the hitchhikers. There's going to be a lot of new needs, and there's going to be a lot of people who want to hitch a ride on the pressing new needs, and you're going to have to be very careful to keep the hitchhikers off the wagon, so to speak, as you move through that. And specifically, in our budget plan, we provided $27 billion for the war against terrorism. That's a $17 billion increase over the previous year's level, and that's just for the not for protecting the homeland, but just for the war against terrorism. And that allowed to pay for 250,000 for deployed troops, enhancing our intelligence operations, unmanned aerial vehicles, precision munitions, and space-based radar. And that was a significant increase over previous year's level and a significant commitment to winning the war against terrorism. For protecting the homeland, we provide $38 billion for that effort, and $8 billion, and this is actually a little bit of a tricky point. If you look at where we ended up last fiscal year is an $8 billion increase. If you look at where we started out, it's actually, we doubled it, and I'll show you that in the next chart. But that allowed for the grants for first responders, defending against bioterrorism, securing our borders, securing our ports, and aviation security. Let me just show you on this next graph. If you look at the 2002 bar and what we spent collectively as a government on Homeland Security is about $19 billion, $19.5 billion. In our emergency response, the $40 billion I referenced earlier, 9.8 of that went to Homeland Security activity. So if you the real measure in my budget world is from where you ended up the year. And so where we ended up is an $8 billion increase. But you've heard people say we doubled the Homeland Security budget. And so from the beginning of the budget year to the beginning of this budget year, it is a doubling. And this next chart at the time we did it was the first chart like this until I saw Greg's chart. He's probably done an updated version of it, but this is, we categorize all the funding requests for Homeland Security by department and agency, and this, I think, was very instructive for our members to see what kind of resources are needed and how widespread throughout the government this effort would be. And I think, in part, as members and as administration began to look at this and realized how many different agencies and departments would be involved in this, I think this helped to give birth to the idea of creating a Homeland Security Department. And on that, let me just touch upon that bill. In the House, we passed the Homeland Security bill this summer, and it was a really Herculean effort to compile that legislation as quickly as we did. And the thought was there's even going to be an attempt to get a bill to the President by September 11th. And so we went like mad to get this thing done in the House. We did it in July, and it has stalled in the Senate since then. And I'm not sure what the fate of that bill will be when Congress returns after the election. But let me move on and just give you an update on sort of where we are with the budget. A lot of times when people ask about funding for a particular item, where something is in the process, I like to again put things in perspective and just say where we are in the budget environment, overall budget environment. One of the things we learned this summer is we had what we call a revenue surprise, and it was not a good revenue surprise. We got a lot less revenue than we'd been planning on getting in, and we've had in the past revenue surprises where we're awash in extra revenue, which is a good surprise. We had a negative surprise. And we found out, too, that the recession in the economy started a lot earlier than previously thought and was a deeper and longer recession than previously thought. And so, as a result, our revenues didn't come in as we'd hoped. There's also a component of that related to capital gains revenue that we saw as the stock market had big losses. Revenues from capital gains dropped off significantly. But nonetheless, even with the revenue shock and all the spending that was done in response to September 11th, we saw temporary and modest deficits and growing back out to a balanced budget a few years out. Now, the key to actually seeing that happen, the budget's return to balance, is contingent on two factors. One is that if we can hold the line on spending, and that is still a question, and I'll get to that later. And two is our revenue picture. I don't know how to quantify it. I do know that revenues are continuing to come in a lot slower than we had hoped, and I just don't know how much. And so that's another factor out there. And I suppose that sort of the third factor in all of this is the potential conflict with Iraq. Obviously, if we have a long, protracted conflict with Iraq, that too will have significant costs and will alter the budget picture considerably. Let me just also walk through, just to show you and put it in perspective, where we are with the budget. In the near term, 2002, 2003, you'll see that we've had significant revenue loss, and that is from the economy, not from the tax cut. The little slivers at the top are the tax cut that Congress intended to lower revenues by. The blue slivers at the bottom are the big chunks that we just saw the revenue not coming in because of the weak economy. In the middle is the spending that Congress has done in response to 9/11. So between, as I mentioned, the triple threat earlier of the terrorist attack and the response to it, the war against terrorism overseas, and the slowing economy, that triple threat really has caused a significant change in the near term in our budget picture. I also like to, whenever I'm asked a question about the budget, it's sort of what happened to that big $5.6 trillion surplus that everyone was talking about in 2001. Well, if you look at the top line, that was the $5.6 trillion surplus over the next decade. The next line down shows you what Congress intentionally did to lower the surplus, and that was between the tax cut we put into place in 2001 and the spending that I mentioned in response to the events of September 11th. The blue swath, if you will, is all of the unanticipated changes both in terms of revenue and in terms of spending programs that get triggered as the economy softens, the federal programs in response to that. So we've had, we intended to lower the surplus by about a half of it, and the other half was unintended consequences. And then the red line shows you sort of where we are as at this point in time, and actually the data for these numbers is from July, so it's a little bit old, but gives you a perspective. And from that, I know Congress has a number of spending initiatives that we'll be considering when we get back that could potentially even lower that those numbers even further. And this just walks you through the numbers of behind those charts. And you can see, again, how significant the economic slowdown has been on our budget picture, both the near and long term. As I mentioned, there are a number of issues for Congress when they return from the elections. First and probably foremost is the discretionary spending, where you've got the Senate at about $14 billion higher than the House. And on that point, an added challenge in all this mix is, for the first time in my memory, we've got essentially 2 of the 13 spending bills that are either have been signed into law or will be signed into law. We've got 11 of the 13 aren't done. They may be written, but they haven't been passed in either body, or a few of them have. And so there's going to be a challenge just to complete them, and there's going to be a challenge to obviously come to an agreement on the overall number, and the $14 billion is separating them. And I should point out, too, a lot of people say, what's the big deal about $14 billion? Well, the reason that we budgeteers are concerned about that is that if you allow that $14 billion to go into the budget over a decade, that adds up to nearly $200 million, or rather $1 billion. That money grows and inflates, and so it's not just what you do today; it has a consequence for tomorrow. There are additional spending issues out there too. The drought assistance is another issue that Congress left undone, and the price tag on that is anywhere from $3 to $6 billion. Medicare provider payments, anywhere again from $30 to $45 billion. That's not even getting into a whole prescription drug benefit, which is costly as well. Potentially additional transportation spending of $4 billion, and an extension of unemployment benefits. And I think sort of the starting bid for that is about $2 billion. It obviously could get much more expensive than that. And so where we end up this year, this is where I stop having any insight, because I've got no idea how Congress will deal with these issues when we come back after your election. There's a lot of factors that may come into play as far as perhaps the outcome of the elections. I don't know if that's going to have a bearing on how Congress will respond to these challenges. In the Senate, they've had a difficult time with a slim majority for the Democrats this year as far as moving legislation. If the Senate temporarily flips to Republicans with the election of Jim Talent in Missouri, and you've got a period where it's back to Republican control before the next Congress starts, I think that could make things more difficult, not less difficult in terms of wrapping things up. And just the other challenge we have is we do have a constitutional requirement to complete our work by January 8th of next year. And if you just look at the calendar, there's not a lot of time to do it. So that's where I run out of insights, and I'll take your questions after that. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions.
Sir.
What's in the CR for Homeland Security? At the level, at the requested level? At last year's level?
On the continuing resolution that we're operating under now is significant for 2 reasons. One is that it essentially goes forward at what we call a current rate. In other words, last year's spending just carried forward, and there's some anomalies that we accounted for within the budget to allow things to just continue smoothly. the significant part of it is that of the $40 billion I mentioned at the outset of my remarks that Congress provided in response to the events of 9/11, there's a lot of us budgeteers who said, now wait a minute, it's not going to cost, we don't have to rebuild the Pentagon every year in perpetuity, don't have to clean up New York every year. And we have identified in a bipartisan, bicameral, and with the administration, we've identified $16 billion of one-time expending that has been limited and backed out of the budget, and so right now that money has been held back. When we come back to writing regular appropriations bills, we'll have that money available to reprogram and respend more appropriately. We just wanted to make sure that we didn't allow things. We wanted to back out those one-time expenses.
Would you come to this standing mic and identify yourself? Thanks.
Paul Polishar, IGI Consulting. Could you tell us the best way to track what's happening in the budget process?
Well, let me plug for our own committee. If you go to www.budget.house.gov, we keep on our website a number of products that track appropriations bills and authorization bills and all the spending bills and tell you what's in the legislation. And as I mentioned, where you've got so much of the budget yet to be written in terms of the appropriations process, and so little time, it's going to be very difficult even for those of us in Congress to track what's going on, because there's going to have to be some sort of expedited process to get through this. So it's going to be difficult even for those of us within, let alone from the outside, but I'll just use our website as a plug, because we try to provide that as service to members and the public.
Please, could you use this mic here for our C-SPAN viewers? This one? Towards the front. Right there. Thank you. And just identify yourself, please.
Michael Meldon, SAIC, Rich. Where's the money in the budget for departmental stand-up?
I'm sorry, could you elaborate further on departmental stand-up?
Sure. We've seen figures for the merged agencies for 03 and 04, but the new department is going to have a budget in and of itself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that is a very tricky issue, in that when the administration proposed this Department of Homeland, I think everyone knew there'd be startup costs, and there's also potential for some savings, but no one was able to quantify those very well, and it's not in this coming fiscal year's budget per se. I think, and this is the challenge, is when you're writing the spending bills for next year, when you don't know whether or not there will be a department existing, because you have to write the law to create it at the same time. That's what makes it so difficult of a job. How do you fund this agency if you don't know if it's going to exist? So that's a challenge we have. So I don't know how that will resolve itself, other than I think that, whether it's in a supplemental spending bill next winter or in the next appropriation cycle, those costs you mentioned will have to be confronted by Congress and administration, and we'll have to figure those out and put those into the budget. But thus far, that's sort of a very difficult thing that we're wrestling with.
Time for one or two more questions. Well, if not, please join me in thanking Bruce DeGrazia for speaking, Greg Pellegrino, and Rich Mead. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Would you like to? That's it. Since the major focus of today's briefing is on transportation security, we thought it important to provide the aviation industry's perspective on Homeland Security. Here to provide that perspective is Scott Yohe, Delta Airlines Senior Vice President for Governmental Affairs. Reporting to the Chairman and CEO of Delta, Mr. Yohe is responsible for the supervision and administration of Delta's government, legislative, and regulatory activities at the international, federal, and state and local levels. A Delta manager since 1978, Mr. Yohe was promoted to Director, Government Affairs in December 1987, to Assistant Vice President, Government Affairs in November 1988, to Vice President in November 1989, and to his current position in October 1996. Prior to beginning his career with Delta, Mr. Yohe served as staff and legislative assistant to former Congressman John J. Flint of Georgia. Having flown Delta since I was 6 years old, it's a pleasure to welcome Delta's Senior Vice President for Government Affairs, Scott Yohe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And my father was a Delta pilot, so I've been flying since I was a baby, so a long time. It's good to be with you this morning to talk about aviation security and specifically to focus on funding and financing for aviation security, which is increasingly becoming a very, very important issue for our industry as we struggle financially and economically with the changes that we've seen since 9/11 and with the economy that we have today. But it's also a very, very fundamental question for Congress from a policy point of view in terms of ultimately deciding and defining exactly who has responsibility for providing for aviation security. I think it's very important in discussing this topic that I provide a little context for you relative to what's going on in the industry. The aviation industry is in serious financial distress. I can't minimize it. We are at a very critical juncture as an industry in terms of surviving. All the major airlines are suffering significantly in terms of losses. We've all taken a number of steps to reduce our costs, but we are fighting a couple of things that we've never seen before. Number one is we're looking at a revenue environment which is historically uniquely different than what we've always seen. Traditionally, the airline industry's revenue has tracked the gross national product for the last 20 years, basically within a correlation of 1 percentage point. What we've seen in the last year is a precipitous drop where you've seen a complete unhinging of that correlation, that relationship. So what we're seeing is the revenue that we're taking in is going down significantly. Average fares are down for Delta this year over year 2000, which is a better measure, by about $25. So the average fare in the year 2000 was about $240. It's now down to about $225. We have no pricing power in this industry. Secondly, what we're seeing is effects of 9/11 and the new security regime that we have, both in terms of cost as well as revenue. And I'll show you some of those numbers in greater detail here in a minute on some slides. Let me first say, though, that the TSA, under the leadership of Admiral Loy, Michael Jackson, Norman Netta, are doing a terrific job and have done a terrific job, as has industry and others since 9/11, in restoring confidence in American people in traveling. We certainly feel like the American public is not fearful of flying, that they feel like the security regime that we have put in place will protect them. And we commend the leadership of TSA and the Bush administration for doing a terrific job in restoring that confidence. Fundamentally, however, the federal government has to take responsibility for aviation security. We supported that. We passed an Aviation Security Act last November that established a federal system. And that was done for a very simple reason. That was that aviation was used as a weapon of mass destruction. and aviation security became national security. It became part of our overall response to terrorism and national defense. It's a fundamental policy point that we all agreed to and we all recognized back last November. The two airlines who tragically were involved were not being singled out by Al-Qaeda. They were simply the instruments for greater destruction and attack on the United States. The Aviation Security Act said that the airline industry had three responsibilities. One, we provide computer assistance passenger profiling for screening and security. Secondly, that we do positive bag match to make sure that every passenger who gets on our plane, every bag that goes on our airplane, there's a passenger associated with that. And finally, to do freight screening. Those were the three responsibilities set forth and mandated in the Aviation Act of last year. Unfortunately, what we've seen is a number of procedures, programs, and policies have been shifted to the airline industry and are creating severe financial problems as a result. We look at before we look at the slides, Leo Mullen and Delta put these charts together, and we did this back last spring. And we did it because we saw a recovery in the first quarter for ourselves, but then in the second quarter, things, began to weaken and worsen. And we were trying to understand why. And we started looking at security and the cost of security. And we quickly found the reason why that we were way off track with respect to the financial forecasts and planning that we had been doing relative to this year. If we look at the first slide, what it shows you is the effect of federal taxes on a ticket. And this is really a broader point that I'm making here, and security is one piece of it. But if you look at the first quarter of 01 versus 02, what you see is a reduction from 274 to 258. And that really relates to the average round-trip fare. And what that says is that certainly there's an excess capacity in our industry right now, and as a result of that, we've got a very weak demand environment. If you look at all the federal taxes that are imposed upon the airline industry, the subtotal pre-9/11, taking the second quarter, was $35. Then, as part of the Aviation Security Act, a $2.50 segment tax or fee was imposed upon the industry. If you take the $7, that's the average that Delta passengers pay by segment. So if you're on a round-trip ticket, if you make a connection, say in Atlanta, then effectively you're paying twice if you're going to a destination. The average for us is about 50% of all of our customers make a change. If you look at the bottom line, the net after taxes, what it shows is that we are taking in less today than we did before. And what this chart shows you is that we have no pricing power. So when Congress said, look, consumers, American public will be happy to pay $10 up to $10 for security. But the point was that they thought that we could pass that tax on, and we can't do that because we do not have any pricing power. So rather than putting it on the top, it goes straight to the bottom. As a result, it becomes a tax on the industry. The other thing that I would point your attention to in the chart is the total amount of taxes. You're talking about $42 on 258. We are the highest taxed industry on the planet. We pay more than tobacco. We pay more than liquor. We are suffocating under the burden of heavy taxation. And the security tax, while well-intended, is simply adding to that financial burden and distress of the industry. If you look at the next chart, what it shows you is Delta has 38 million tickets sold times the average $7. So the effect of the tax on Delta Airlines, we estimate to be $266 million. Compare that to what the analyst pre-tax loss for 2002 is, which is $1.3 billion. The next chart looks at insurance, and this is something that a lot of industries have seen and experienced. Our war risk portion of our overall insurance policy was negligible pre-9/11. Delta paid $2 million. Today, we're paying $150 million for terrorism insurance. The next chart shows you a series of what I like to call unfunded mandates, where costs have been shifted to the industry where we believe should be borne by the federal government. First, following 9/11, the FAA and DOT eliminated us as a carrier of mail over 16 ounces because of the concern about something larger than that not being screened, potentially could be an explosive device. So we are the largest customer carrier of mail. So we lost $50 million in mail. Freight restrictions, they had new restrictions on freight where a lot of shippers that were not known to us no longer could ship on our airline. We lost $40 million. Cockpit door fortification, we've been reimbursed some of the portion of the retrofit associated with that, but we're still owed $18 million. Federal Air Marshals, they sit in first class. Increasingly, as the crowds have come back and as our first class cabin is full, they are now beginning to displace revenue passengers, and we have to carry them. The $35 million that you see is a very conservative figure. It's based upon an average $300 fare, so we think that's actually probably very conservative. The last one is the one that to me is the most frustrating, because it relates to $62 million, relates to a series of functions like ramp security, checkpoint document verification, screening and catering, airport space occupied by TSA, security equipment now taken over by TSA, and training. All of these things are requirements that are imposed upon us by the new federal system, by the TSA, and are functions that we are doing in a lot of cases for TSA, essentially as a contractor, for which we are not being reimbursed. So you add all of that up, and that's 205. Now, if you look at the total effect of all of this on Delta Airlines as one airline, what you see is $621 million. So that's the consequences, the economic financial consequences on Delta Airlines of the new security regime that we have created post 9/11. The next chart looks at the infamous hassle factor. And the hassle factor is simply derived from surveys that we did on a number of our best customers who cut back substantially this year in their flying. And when we asked them why, about 22% of them said, I just don't like going through security, either because of the unpredictability of it, the time associated with it, the hassle associated with it. I'm simply cutting back my flying because it's just not something that I want to do as much as I used to for a variety of reasons. If you look at what the revenue decrement was to Delta in the first half of 02 versus 01 is over $1 billion. And you take 22% of that and you run the numbers out, we calculate the revenue loss associated with people flying less because of the hassle associated with flying to be $410 million. So you add all of that up together, and the economic impact for Delta Airlines is over $1 billion. Keep in mind that I indicated that $1.3 billion was the Wall Street consensus estimate on what Delta Airlines would lose this year. So essentially, most all of our losses are associated with a new security regime that we have today. If go to the next chart. Why don't you just go to the next chart, Charlene? Delta is roughly 1/6 of the industry, so if you wanted to use our numbers and extrapolate to the industry, and granted it is a little rough because there are certainly differences, but if you multiply times 6, that $1 billion, what you see is for the airline industry as a whole, it's over $6 billion. And certainly if you look at the security and insurance and government policy impact, we're approaching $4 billion for the airline industry. And the airline industry this year is looking at now that the analysts have revised the loss estimates for this year. Initially, we were expecting them to be when the year started, we thought this was going to be a year of recovery. We thought we would end up at about $2.5 billion in losses this year. We're now going to exceed $8 billion in losses this year, or pushing $8 billion in losses this year as an industry. Finally, let me just run through quickly what we've been talking to people in this town about, both in the executive branch as well as on Capitol Hill, relative to what we think is a 7-point plan that is absolutely essential for this government to implement if we are going to relieve the airline industry of this burden. Folks, it's really quite simple. This industry simply cannot carry this burden. We can't. And if the government wants a healthy aviation system, we're going to have to take a very, very hard look at how aviation security is financed today, and some relief is going to have to be provided. So what we are advocating is essentially that the government take responsibility for funding aviation security, because again, it is a national security and a national defense function. We are the only industry in America that has this burden. I noted that the Senator Hollins indicated the other day as part of the conference for the port security that the industry is not going to have to pay a tax or a fee to support new security associated with ports. Again, the aviation industry has been singled out. We think that needs to change. So the first thing that we think needs to happen is to eliminate the segment fee. That segment fee for the industry is about $1.6 billion, or the segment tax. Secondly, we need to provide terrorism and war risk reinsurance for at least 1 year. Hopefully after a year's time, we will be able to see a return of the private market, and we think it will. We were actually doing some things on a joint risk retention group basis among the carriers to try to create more of a private market for insurance, because obviously the war risk market disappeared for us after 9/11. We'd like to see an immediate authorization for carriage of U.S. priority mail over 16 ounces. TSA is taking steps, in fact, to do that, and we're very optimistic that that's going to happen. We want reimbursement for the unfunded mandates. We haven't made a lot of progress on that with TSA, so we've gone to Congress. Congressman Micah, in a bill that he's passed out of the Aviation Subcommittee, would in fact authorize and require that the TSA reimburse the airlines for those functions and for those activities. I haven't talked about baggage screening, but there's two other huge looming costs out there that are not reflected in the $5.1 billion, I don't think, that you saw earlier for FY03 for TSA, and that is a requirement for all baggage to be screened by explosive detection systems. I think that the numbers that are in there are grossly low and certainly not adequate in order to purchase and install the machines and to hire the personnel necessary to meet that requirement. Both bodies of Congress, but in different legislation, have passed provision that would relax that requirement. That needs to happen. Otherwise, we're going to see chaos in our airports at the end of the year as we try to force a solution that the system is simply not ready for. Currently, the airlines are paying a fee to the TSA, if you can believe it, a monthly fee for Delta. It's about $350 million a year, for the industry. And those are the costs that we paid for screening in the year 2000 that the government is collecting from us under the theory that because we are no longer performing those functions, there's a savings to us, therefore we should pay the TSA for relieving us of those responsibilities. And finally, you've heard a lot about the Armed Pilot Program. Admiral Loy has estimated that program is going to cost about $900 million. He said he didn't know where he's going to get the money to pay for it. It's certainly, I don't think, reflected in the $5 billion request. We certainly can't afford to pay for it, so it's a looming cost out there that we're not sure who's going to pay for it, and we certainly can't afford to pay for it. With that, I'm going to finish. I don't know if I have time for questions.
Time for
one question.
Have a question for Scott? Please join me in thanking Scott for his excellent presentation. Thank you. Appreciate it. The vast majority of this nation's infrastructure is owned by the corporate sector, and most of the Homeland Security applications are products and services which are best provided by the corporate sector. This is why we believe it is important to provide you with briefing presentations on corporate capabilities for Homeland Security. Here to provide you with today's presentation is Rick Stevens, Boeing's Vice President and General Manager for Homeland Defense, a position to which he was assigned this past July. He focuses on ensuring that Boeing and its partners provide and support integrated network-centric systems to meet the Homeland Security needs of the United States and promote the use of the technology to meet related market needs. Prior to this assignment, Mr. Stevens led a number of Boeing businesses, including space and communications systems, reusable space systems, naval systems, and tactical systems. During a career that spans more than 20 years, he has provided leadership on programs that included intercontinental ballistic missile guidance and control systems, tactical missiles, submarine combat systems, the space shuttle, and a number of service and support-related programs. Please join me in welcoming Rick Stevens.
Thank you. Bill, thanks very much. See, when most people think of the Boeing company, I think a lot think of commercial airlines and the commercial airline industry. And while that is an important part of Boeing's overall business, what I'm here to talk today about is the Homeland Security side, which is really aimed at how do we maintain and ensure we've got the right systems in place to protect our homeland, in which we all cherish and enjoy. The focus that I will talk about is some of the corporate capabilities for Homeland Security. And as part of that, I'll give some sense of Boeing's capabilities in that area, but I'll also address some of the changing business and economics environments that Scott talked to earlier with regard to the impact on the airline industry. Boeing's, Boeing's first entry into the Homeland Security area was, in fact, with the airport explosive detection system, which Scott talked about earlier, having some potential impact on the airline industry, and those costs yet to be fully identified. For us, it's a multi-year contract working with the Transportation Security Administration, and is really involved in making sure we've got a safe and efficient process that goes in place for the Transportation Security Administration employees to do check baggage through all of our 400-plus airports in the nation. In addition, Boeing is also involved in, of course, installation of airline cockpit doors, and by July or by April of this next year. And we also have a number of other initiatives that we're involved in. I think an important part of when we look at Homeland Security, and was alluded to earlier, is that Homeland Security is more than just about connecting information and providing individual capabilities. It really is about doing what we call large-scale systems integration. That's being able to do more than connect the pipes of information. It's being able to evaluate the information that across those communication mechanisms and delivering it to the customers who are trying to ensure they've got the right sensor information about where the potential threats are against the homeland, and then to be able to deploy resources to be able to go thwart those potential threats. If we look at the skills that we're bringing to the table in order to meet that need, it really is an activity borne out by a number of years of what we call this large-scale systems integration. If you look at a commercial airline, 777, over 3 million parts, now that's but one example of large-scale systems integration. But I think another one is the most recent activity that we have with the Army on Future Combat System. And most would look at the Boeing company and say, what's Boeing doing working with the Army in Future Combat System? Future Combat System is the Army's transformational program, which is really looking at battle in the future and thinking about what's the information you need from sensors, being able to integrate it in such a way that you're able to make timely decisions on the battlefield, and then being able to deploy the resources necessary to be successful and win any engagement. It says you, in some cases, need to look at not so much having many tanks and heavy armored capabilities that we saw during the Kuwait activities over 10 years ago, but look at not only where are the forces of the enemy and what resources can our armed forces deliver to be able to thwart that. And it means it's a smaller, lighter, much more capable force that requires much less logistic support and infrastructure to sustain it over time. So that's an example of what you get out of large-scale systems integration. That large-scale systems integration activity is borne out by the same activities we employ in our missile defense programs, space station, and other integrated battle space. The Homeland Security challenge is exactly the same. How are you able to deliver a capability with the minimum amount of resources while still maintaining the security required by us as a population in our nation? If we look at what's going on today, of course, aviation is the highest area of focus, and our commitment in restoring passenger confidence in commercial aviation is paramount to the Boeing Company. We, too, were deeply affected by the tragedy that occurred well over a year ago, and we feel that that's the first priority where we believe we can really add value because of our intimate knowledge of the airline industry and our intimate knowledge of the large-scale systems integration. I think to point out a couple of the economic paramounts in this particular industry, aviation's impact to the U.S. economy exceeds over $900 billion on an annual basis. That's 9% of the gross domestic product. Aviation supports over 11 million American jobs. Every day we are made to understand that a rise in cost and the hassle factor associated with increased security will further hurt the industry. But investments in aviation security and in infrastructure also produce very, very positive returns. If we look at the challenge that my particular business has right now, it is in fact to be able to install up to 7,000 pieces of equipment in this nation's 400-plus airports and train about 20,000 Transportation Security Administration employees to operate that equipment safely, efficiently, and effectively. When we awarded this contract on the 7th of June, we had 207 days to get the job done by the end of this year, so no small feat. We've got well over 150 teams out deployed today across America's airports working that activity. I'm pleased to say as of today we have 37 airports complete. We have 101 airports under construction, and we'll have another 55 airports under construction for installation of the EDS, explosive detection system, and explosive trace detectors, and are well on our way to be able to drive towards the end of the year. I think one of the biggest and most challenging activities we've had in doing that is to look at all the stakeholders who are in fact involved in one form or another, making sure that we're successful employing this equipment. We look at the role that the government plays, particularly TSA. We look at the role that the airlines play, particularly because of the financial impact that they are currently bearing. If we look at the impact of the airports and their role and responsibilities for covering a lot of the financial aspects of this, we also look at shareholders, those who make investments in aviation industry, as well as the bondholders in many cases who have the responsibility for financing the airports. It is no small feat. If you look at what Admiral Loy has requested in the Transportation Security Administration, the $5.1 billion plus, in order to get that through in our 2003 budget, it is really an important key ingredient to make sure that Congress takes the action to respond to that if, in fact, we're going to be successful meeting the federal mandate. If you also look at some of the challenges that we face, there's a whole new business infrastructure and a whole new change in market dynamics that has resulted from the Homeland Security requirements. If you just look at airports, if you look at what the airports, how they fund their current requirements, they have bondholders, and essentially they are a facility, to be able to provide services to the airline industry. But they have bondholders, and they have their debts to meet. There's also the Airport Improvement Program, which is currently a process whereby there's funding pulled together to do requirements such as extend runways or new capital improvements. That has come under tremendous burden as you look at where those funds need to get allocated to be able to meet the new federal security requirements. There's the passenger service fees. There's also the issues indemnification. Who will feel the responsibility in the event that there is in fact a breach of security? And then, as you also heard from Delta Airlines earlier, this notion about the impact that they've had on insurance. Certainly a significant amount of turmoil and challenge as we look at this new business environment and the role that the government plays, the the role that industry plays, not only from an aviation standpoint, but the role that industry plays in meeting the requirements of the new Homeland Security needs. I believe this concept and this thought that was brought up earlier by Delta Airlines and the thought about where all the funding comes from is one that we're going to continue to see debated and discussed over time. And I think the charge that we all have, being participants in the Homeland Security activity, is to help ensure we have a good, open, honest discussion, make sure we have the information on the table, and then continue to discuss what those new relationships and alignments will be. Because in order for business to be successful, they must be able to make a reasonable return. Otherwise, investors will not participate in making the investments in the American business. So I think if I look at the most paramount challenges of Homeland Security, setting aside, course number one is to make sure we've got a safe homeland. This whole discussion about where we're on the financial aspects is very important. And I can tell you as I go airport by airport, I said 400 plus airports, each one has a different business model. Each of the airlines has a different business model, and trying to get them integrated is in fact a significant challenge. Let me move off though transportation and aviation security for a moment, talk about some of the other capabilities that I believe are in fact important to be successful in Homeland Security. The one that is that you've seen highlighted, of course, from a President's budget standpoint and the congressional action is in fact emergency preparedness and response. If we look at the way in which funding is allocated, of course, it comes from a top-down standpoint, but it gets implemented at a local level. In order to be successful, having an integrated Homeland Security across America, one of the areas where I believe we need increased emphasis is, in fact, on standardization of communications, IT infrastructure, and all of that in order to ensure that we are, in fact, able to share information and to be able to share communications, which is vital to first responders' capability to be able to meet their needs. We have a number of contracts in that area where we're working to be able to help support that. I think probably one other area that's vitally important when you talk about standardization is making sure that we all have a well-understood architecture for implementation of our Homeland Security requirements. Once again, going back to the standardization, make sure we have standards in place and be able to integrate that in such a way that you're able to have top-down planning from a federal government standpoint about what is our overall policy and our strategy, but then to be able to have bottoms-up reporting when we're responding to particular incidents so that our first responders, when they're on the scene, they're able to report back their particular situation at their respective headquarters and then tier that up to the levels, whether it be at a regional level, at a state level, or a national level. And so I think we have some major challenges to work there as we work towards standardization, because one of my observations thus far is we in industry all have our competitive needs and desires to be able to meet our shareholder requirements. There are many, many proprietary solutions that are out there, and it's time to be able to open up the proprietary solutions into integrated systems, open architecture that allows the communication and information to flow freely to be able to meet our Homeland Security needs. And so let me take it back to, from a Boeing perspective, that is in fact the focus that we have in our company. We are looking for best of breed as part of our systems integration responsibility, and we tend to partner and team with those who have open systems architectures that will in fact enable free flowing of information, communication in such a way that we have and support an integrated Homeland Security system across the nation, across the 50 states, and across the local municipalities that allow our first responders to meet local needs. The success of American companies in our global markets is in large extent due to the strength of our Americans' transportation infrastructure. Our nation's highways, railways, seaports, inland waterways, airports, and air traffic system have given U.S. business, large and small, rural and urban, an unmatched ability to move people and goods safely, efficiently, reliably, and affordably around our country and around the world. Our well-deserved, our well-developed transportation systems have given a strong competitive edge that we cannot afford to lose. We must do everything that we can to integrate our capabilities and ensure that our infrastructure remains the world's best, most secure, and safest. And that means taking the critical steps to manage the knowledge inherent to the overarching architecture and individual nodes in each of our systems, and truly have an integrated Homeland Security system. Those are the end of my prepared remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rick, for your excellent presentation. And we'd like to ask the members of our next panel to come forward now. We are now pleased to bring you a powerful session on Homeland Security programs and procurement, consisting of top speakers from the U.S. Coast Guard, Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Transit Administration, and National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a privilege to introduce this session's moderator, Bruce Aiken. Mr. Aiken is the founder and president of the Homeland Security Industries Association and a co-chair of the Aiken, Irvin, Berlin, and Vrooman law firm. He has 25 years of experience in trade association management and counseling, particularly in the transportation and high-tech areas. Mr. Aiken is the only American to have been appointed to all the major international dispute resolution panels, including the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, WTO, and the World Intellectual Property Organization. A graduate of American University Law School and Columbia University Graduate School, Mr. Aiken is admitted to practice law before the United States Supreme Court. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Aiken. Bruce.
Thanks, Bill. Our thanks to Equity International for hosting this important conference and to C-SPAN for covering it. There is no greater national nor international priority than Homeland Security. Our country is known as the land of the free, but we're something less than that if our citizens cannot go about their lives in safety. We have the greatest economic engine on earth, but it cannot operate optimally if its assets are subject to attack and if its intellectual property is subject to cyber terrorism. So Homeland Security is the business of all businesses and indeed all citizens. We believe that an ongoing effort must be made to continue to find the best technology and solutions to protect our homeland. And this necessarily involves business-government dialogue and cooperation. Therefore, one mantra, if you will, of HSIA has been that there should be a set or a system of industry sector advisory committees for Homeland Security, including security-cleared leaders from industry covering the disparate and varied kinds of companies that constitute this sector. ISECs have existed in the international trade area for decades. That's why HSIA was formed. Earlier this morning, you heard from our chairman, Bruce DeGrazia, who is from Versar, Inc., an internationally known bioagent screening firm. Our vice chairman, Joe D'Agostino, is a vice president with Haynes Security, which has been top-rated for airport security by the FAA and was given the contract to secure New York City's tunnels and bridges after 9/11, a completely different type of company. HSIA's members are disparate in function and vary enormously in size. They include such industry giants as Fluor Corporation, General Dynamics, HDR, Lockheed Martin, Worldwide Security Associates, but it also includes such Homeland Security financing firms as AR Challenges and even such high-tech startups as Oxford Microdevices. A full list of our members is available at our website at www.hsianet.org. Derek, let's go to the next chart. 9/11 fundamentally altered the business of Homeland Security industries. Where before 9/11, airport security firms such as Worldwide Security Associates and Haynes negotiated contracts directly with the airlines, now and in the future, they will deal with TSA. In short, the business of Homeland Security will increasingly be characterized by federal, state, and local government contracting. But this isn't merely federalization of Homeland Security. Thousands of state and local authorities will be engaged in Homeland Security procurement. For example, earlier this year, the Environmental Protection Agency announced a program to fund municipal vulnerability assessments for water utilities around the country. We estimate that 10,000 water utilities will be involved. Prior to 9/11, as earlier speakers have commented, less than $20 billion a year in government funds was spent on Homeland Security. Of that, nearly $8 billion was spent on our servicemen and servicewomen who helped to secure our facilities here and abroad. In fiscal year 2002, as you know, half of the money authorized by Congress was held back and $20 billion was authorized, and we estimate that TSA will spend something like an additional $4 billion. But this is merely the beginning. We anticipate that over time there will be $130 to $140 billion in new government spending at the federal, state, and local level on Homeland Security. There simply has not been a change in a sector of the U.S. economy like this since the 1930s. Derek, let's go to the next chart. We're very pleased to have been invited by Equity, and I'm honored to have the role of a moderator for such a distinguished group of speakers. They include, to my right, Rear Admiral Paul J. Pluta, Assistant Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. Second will be Gary Brill, Alternative Information Systems Security Manager of the Federal Aviation Administration. Then Leonard Diamond, Program Manager of the Federal Transit Administration. And finally, Dr. Omid Omidvar, Program Manager at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm going to briefly introduce each speaker before his presentation and then call on them to speak for 10 minutes since we have less than an hour to keep to our schedule. And I'll let each speaker know when they have 1 minute left. Then if we have time remaining, we'll briefly take Q&A. I'm very pleased to introduce as our first speaker Rear Admiral Paul J. Pluta, Assistant Commandant for Marine Safety, Security, and Environmental Protection of the U.S. Coast Guard. He assumed the duties of Assistant Commandant in May 2001. In that capacity, Admiral Pluta directs national and international regulatory programs for commercial vessel safety, port safety and security, waterways management, and marine environmental protection. Admiral Pluta is a 1967 graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. He holds an MSc degree in Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering from the University of Michigan. From 1988 to 91, he served as Commanding Officer, Maritime Security Office, where his command played a key role in support of Operation Desert Storm. He is a distinguished speaker, a holder of the Legion of Merit, Meritorious Service Medal, and 2 Coast Guard commendations. I'm very honored to introduce Admiral Pluta.
Thank you very much. I wish my mother were here to hear that introduction. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's really an honor for me to be here with all of you and this distinguished panel with which we share the dais. I'm not Admiral Loy. He's much taller and much better looking than I am, but he's got a lot bigger headaches than I do, so I don't feel ill at ease talking about him. Great guy, too. Good morning. I'm here on behalf of Admiral Tom Collins, the new Commandant of the Coast Guard, to talk to you about the Coast Guard and maritime homeland security. With regard to my presentation, with any luck at all, by the time my remarks are complete, I will have provided you with some insight on these issues, the balance between security and mobility, overall Coast Guard impacts, the resource implications on our service, and our ability to sustain the other Coast Guard missions as well as maritime homeland security. As you've heard earlier, it's become cliche to say that the world has changed dramatically since 9/11. I'd like you to know that your Coast Guard has changed dramatically since 9/11 as well. We certainly are working much more closely, much more often, with more federal, state, and local agencies and with the private sector than ever before. We've prided ourselves on being a networking organization in the past, and we've capitalized on those skills as we deal with our challenges today. Also, we've participated in the strategic planning on the national level with regard to homeland security so that our Coast Guard strategic plan for maritime homeland security will be in vertical alignment with the President's plan and with the rest of the plans intervening between ours and his. Events have shown us that our transportation system is a target. During my days as the Director of Intelligence and Security for the Department of Transportation, I was hearing about Osama bin Laden before his name became a household word. And transportation around the world has been a target for a long time. With regard to the maritime sector that I focus on in this assignment, our ports have been shown to be both very valuable, as you've heard, with all of the commodities coming into our country by sea, but also very vulnerable, as the Seaport Security Commission has told us. We're confronting this new class of threats, but it's not a simple task. Our biggest challenge today is how to ensure that legitimate cargo is not delayed while these new security enhancements are introduced. We do have to maintain that balance. Among the strategic objectives of the Department of Transportation are both security and mobility, and we take both of those very seriously and try to keep them in balance. And this balance is definitely a competing interest, but it doesn't have to be exclusionary if treated right. There's no surprise that sustaining our mobility in the face of security will come at some price, but the key is to minimize this cost and make sure that it's distributed among all of the stakeholders. A critical factor in meeting our challenges has been this is the Coast Guard's internal view of how we've met our challenge here, is that we're military, we're maritime, and we're multi-mission. There's a lot of talk about the new Department of Homeland Security and what is that going to do to the Coast Guard. If that should come to pass, both the President and our organization have gone on record as asking that we move intact with all our missions and all our people because of the character and the services that we provide to our country. A roles and mission study of the Coast Guard conducted by some skeptics said that if there weren't a Coast Guard, we'd have to invent one. All of our missions fit together very nicely in support of our country and have done so since we were created as the Revenue Cutter Service in 1790 to protect our coasts. Internationally, the array of missions that the Coast Guard has is the envy of other maritime nations. Our military discipline, our maritime worldwide impact, and our multi-mission capability. That's security, safety, environmental protection, law enforcement, aids to navigation. And now we're a member of the U.S. intelligence community as well. Has served us well, and we still have a lot to offer. After 9/11, the Coast Guard immediately mobilized more than 2,000 reservists in the largest homeland defense and port security operation since World War II. Pre-9/11, Marine Safety allocated 14% of our mission portfolio to marine safety and security. Immediately following 9/11, over half, and I've heard 58% of the Coast Guard operating expenses were directed towards homeland security. Our goal in the future is, as the budget catches up with things, to help balance the new normalcy, that Homeland Security would represent approximately 20 to 25% of our overall operating expenses. We're very proud of what we did in response to the tragedies of 9/11. We're basically a response organization, and this next chart will help graphically show you the transition that occurred in a relatively short period of time. This first slide illustrates the laydown of our forces on the morning of September 11th, just prior to the attack. As you can see, the Coast Guard was operating across our entire range of missions. We were conducting counter-drug patrols in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. We were conducting fisheries boardings off New England and Alaska. Routine marine safety activities were being conducted in all of our ports and in the territorial seas. And search and rescue missions were being conducted wherever and whenever necessary to protect our citizens. On this next slide, the orange dots indicate key ports, the red dots indicate law enforcement missions, and the green dots indicate port security missions. In the manner in which we think we best serve the American public, without being directed and without a specific plan to deploy our forces, we essentially reconfigured the Coast Guard virtually overnight to meet the needs of our nation. In the immediate aftermath of this terrorist attack, the Coast Guard reassessed all our missions, reallocated our operational forces with the intent of meeting domestic port security and harbor defense requirements. It was a dynamic shift of resources and priorities accompanying this initial threat response. It's consistent with the administration's and the American people's desires of our service. Our posture today represents a more measured balance than you see depicted on the screen. We have returned to our core missions, yet we still have maintained a heightened focus on homeland security in all of our ports and coastal approaches. Also not well known is because of our hazardous materials capability and our incident command system capability. Our National Strike Force responded as primary responders and the organizational coordinators for both anthrax incidents in Boca Raton, Florida, and here in Washington, D.C. at the Senate building, and also dealt with all of the hazardous materials issues at Ground Zero, as you might expect. We're a small organization, and it should be no surprise that with this increased emphasis on maritime homeland security, we will have a challenge in sustaining this capability over time. The Coast Guard needed a multi-year infusion of capability and capacity to meet all our responsibilities and missions. We've achieved support from the President, from Secretary Mineta, and from our Congress very strongly. We were the beneficiary of a fiscal year 02 supplemental, and our fiscal year 03 budget request is also going to help us with this critical start at increasing our capability to meet the new challenges of maritime homeland security. The FY02 fall supplemental infused needed dollars to jumpstart our first step towards day-to-day maritime operations under a new normalcy. The spring supplemental continued the needed funding stream from the fall, and the FY03 budget currently before Congress adds a full year's build on these capabilities to enhance maritime homeland security and search and rescue improvements. How are we doing?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Just some quick examples as I close out here. Maritime domain awareness sounds like a buzzword, but it means knowing what vessels, what cargo, what people are headed towards the United States so that we can vet all of those before they come into our ports. Port security assessments are currently being done among the 55 major strategic and economic ports of our country. Increased marine safety patrols on both land and shore are being conducted, and we've created new maritime safety and security teams that will be distributed around the country for the surge capacity to deal with new security challenges in the future. The future requires a new strategy of better awareness, better preventive security measures, and broader cooperation among all the folks that we work with. We will continue to build upon our past efforts to restore our readiness and shape our Coast Guard future, and the end result will be a more capable Coast Guard currently positioned for the transformation into the 21st century, better serving the maritime homeland security needs of our country. Thank you very much. Semper Paratus.
Thank you, Admiral Pluta. Our next speaker is Gary Brill. Mr. Brill has 20 years of technology management experience, both as a contractor and as a federal technical advisor and a security manager. He's currently the alternate information systems security manager for the Office of Regulation and Certification at the Federal Aviation Administration. In that role, he shares responsibility for managing the security certifications of more than 150 lands and over 50 information security systems and applications. Mr. Brill was awarded his Certified Information Systems Professional designation in 2000. He's an undergraduate education was at Kent State University and has an MBA from Temple University. And I can't finish this introduction without noting, as an 11-year assistant scoutmaster, that he's also active in the Boy Scouts. I'm very happy to introduce Gary Brill.
Do we have slides yet? Thank you for the introduction. I'd like to thank Equity for the opportunity to participate in this conference, in this briefing. Good. If we can flip to our first slide. I'm going to be going over a few things very quickly. I'm not talking as much about money per se as what it is that is out there right now, really looking at the biometric piece. Biometrics has a strong promise, better physical access control. It can work with other systems, but it won't work alone. For example, you can have a perfect biometric that lets in only the right person, but if you don't have anti-tailgating devices behind them, 3 more people can slip in and your security is gone. System identification authentication authentication, knowing when you connect into a system that it's really the right person. 2 reasons this is more important. One is digital signature. If you're using digital signature in commerce, you want to know that you are dealing with the person who's actually authorized to sign and not somebody who figured out their password. Also, single sign-on. We've increased security. People have passwords that are about this long, and everybody tells them not to write them down. And they have passwords for every one of the systems. Single sign-on is the solution for that. Unfortunately, if you don't protect your credentials to get into your single sign-on, you haven't given away the keys to one system, you've given away the keys to everything. The last thing we have is the face in a crowd. We'll be talking about that on one of the future slides. Next slide, please. New drivers for biometrics, the USA Patriot Act, the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Reform Act. Under that, all U.S. travel documents that are issued to aliens on or after October 6th, 2004 have to have biometrics integrated in with them. What's happening in the market? 2 things that I'd like to talk about here. 2 years ago at the Biometrics Consortium conference, excellent conference that I've attended, one of the speakers put up a growth curve that said, here's what's happening with the market. Now, this was in 2000, and they put up a curve, exponential, that went up like that. And they looked down at the slide, and the slide said 1998, and he said, whoop, I put the wrong slide on. He said, let me get this year's. And he put up a slide that was exactly the same curve. The year was moved down, it was 99. Well, essentially, every year, that same graph keeps moving out. This year, we have some very strong drivers with this legislation that maybe this will be the year, but we had a question at this several weeks ago at this last biometrics conference from one of the people, one of the attendees, who said, there was a call, the industry responded, we've got all these products, when is the money going to start flowing? Well, that one I can't answer. That's way above my pay grade to decide when the government is going to start really heavily investing. A couple things that are going on right now that I can talk about. In transportation, Transportation Security Administration has pilots that are going to be in 20-plus airports. We'll talk about that in another slide. Border crossings, INS, announced in testimony several weeks ago, they're going to begin testing biometric verification systems at 6 ports of entry. The border crossing card is out there. It uses 2 fingerprints and a photo with embedded in a digital stripe. Since 1998, they've issued 5 million cards. InsPass is out there that uses hand geometry and an enrollment card. One of the big things, if we can go to the next one, one of the big things going on in facial recognition right now is the NIST Face Recognition Vendor Test 2002. It's sponsored or supported by, well, NIST, DARPA, and 15 other organizations. Given the time constraints we have, I can't run through all of them. We have 14 companies that are participating in that, and the whole goal is to measure the accuracy of biometric technologies. The results are due just in several weeks. They're supposed to be coming out in early November. 2 tests that to mention. One is the high computational intensity test. It compares a still database of full face photos. Full face photos are important. That's what all the passport photos are. Full face frontal images against an unknown person. It is high computational intensity. They're comparing against a set of 121,000 images and matching all possible pairs. It's a very heavy-duty test. The medium computational intensity test is looking at the participants' capability to do face recognition with still and video formats under varying conditions. The problem with face recognition, the problem with iris, with both of those you're dealing with cameras. Whenever you're dealing with cameras, lighting, glare, these things become important. So systems that will work well in one condition may not work as well. If you ask what is a perfect biometric, the perfect biometric really depends on what is the application that you have. If we can go to the next slide, please. A couple things that are going on now with facial recognition. 3D modeling is very prevalent. Well, I can't say very prevalent right now. It's starting to appear. I saw 4 vendors at the last conference that are working with some type of 3D modeling. Why do we want to do it? To improve the matches and also to stop spoofing. Talking with one of the people at DoD who evaluates biometrics, when they were looking at how the facial recognition worked, one of the great ways to spoof that is to take a photograph, blow it up, put it on as a mask, and see if you can fool the system. That should not work with a 3D model. That would be able to see through that and prevent that type of spoofing. They're using 2 different things. One company was using a camera that takes 3D pictures. The other company, or the other 3 companies, were doing variations of transforming 2-dimensional photographs into 3-dimensional, because again, we have this huge backlog, or this huge already built library of the passport photos and so forth. Face in a crowd. Face in a crowd has gotten a lot of attention in the media. The Super Bowl, they scanned everybody in the crowd at Super Bowl, I think it was 35. I had the opportunity to talk to someone who was participating in that scanning. They had a camera that captured everybody as they came in the gate, and then they sat down and watched the processing. They got 19 potentials, handed them out to the police officers that were there, and the police officers went scurrying around the stadium looking for people. No arrests came out of that, although it was interesting to watch what went on. Tampa police, Ybor City, that got a lot of attention. I remember seeing, I can't remember which news magazine it was, but somebody did a whole segment on it. Very interesting to watch. Did not work well. They were using existing cameras. It was not put in for face recognition. They were using existing cameras to use face recognition as well. They had to zoom in on a face to be able to get it. That did not work well. Something that we heard about 2 years ago, the London Borough of Newham used cameras for surveillance as well as face recognition. They were getting about a 50% rate on the face recognition, but their methodology was if something happens or if they see something likely, they send a police officer out. Well, it gives them increased visibility of the police in that particular area. What happened in London with a lot of cameras is the thieves and so forth saw where the cameras were not interested in being photographed, moved someplace else. Well, it may not catch them. Okay. I just got shortened a little bit. So let me drop down. Biometrics in airports, if you can switch to the next slide. We have a number of airports. Hand geometry in San Francisco. O'Hare is using fingerprints. Charlotte Douglas International is using iris. We've got facial recognition in Palm Beach, which didn't work real well. Also in St. Petersburg, Clearwater, and Fresno, where it appears to be working. The TSA pilots, they're planning on going out in 20 different airports, looking at face, finger, iris, hand geometry, voice recognition, small-scale deployments, 3 to 6 months in duration, and the end result of that is a body of knowledge to be used by the airports and by TSA. So between the face recognition vendor test and the body of knowledge, Office of Legislative Counsel is using it for system access. They've been showing it around the Capitol. The Pentagon Officers Athletic Club is using it for facility access. You don't have to carry anything with you in your job. And one of the more interesting things, one of the United Nations relief efforts is using it to make sure that when a refugee gets a package, they only get one blanket and set of food and not multiple. They don't care who you are. They're just tracking to make sure that you only get one package one time. Anyway, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Brill. Our next speaker is Leonard Diamond, who's the Senior Security and Emergency Management Specialist of the Federal Transit Administration.
He began his law enforcement career as a police officer with Middlesex County Department of Public and Police and Public Safety in Edison, New Jersey. I might add the owner of our vice chairman in security also started as a police officer. Mr. Diamond, with the creation of the New Jersey Transit Police Department in 1992, assumed responsibility for mandated and in-service training for all sworn and non-sworn members as manager of Police Support Services and Emergency Management Division of the New Jersey Transit Police Department. This is the third largest transportation system in the United States. Mr. Diamond holds an AAS Police Science degree from Middlesex College in Edison, New Jersey. He is currently getting a graduate degree at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey. He's a certified instructor for the State of New Jersey Police Training Commission. And from 1998 to this past June, served as chair of the American Public Transportation Association's Committee on Public Safety. I'm very pleased to introduce Leonard Diamond.
Good morning, everyone. First off, I'd like to express my thanks and good to see my good friend, Edmond. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. We served as myself, the chair of the Active Committee on Public Safety, which represented our chiefs and directors in the country, and at the time, the Admiral was the director of the Office of Intelligence and Security. Also a former resident and native of New Jersey, so we share some common friends. And it was good to see the Admiral, and also to be part of such a distinguished panel this morning. Thank you very much. And to express on behalf of our administrator, Janet Dorn, and our Deputy Administrator, Robert Jamison, the opportunity to speak here at the summit this morning, briefing from hosted by Equity International. What I'd like to try and do, we'll bring up the slides if we can. We'll just prepare that. I'll just briefly, while they're preparing the slides, I have just a few for you. On September 11th, I was employed at New Jersey Transit Police. On that particular morning, as a first responder, as you've heard from many of our speakers this morning, we had the appropriate training. We had worked with our colleagues in New York and New Jersey. New Jersey Transit being the only statewide transit agency in the country, besides dealing with our counterparts in New York City and Philadelphia. So we had practiced, and as many of our leaders, from Secretary Mineta to our Administrator Dorn, has spoken many times, between the practices and the opportunity to share our knowledge, whether it be at a tabletop or whether it is at a full-scale drill, really lent itself to the opportunities to do the right thing on the morning of September 11th. And not knowing the entire picture because we were fully involved in the terrorist attack on that morning, not knowing what was happening here in Washington. I came to Washington at the Federal Transit Administration in February of this year to serve as our senior security and emergency management specialist. And with that dynamic, I brought the knowledge of knowing what the first responders have and what they need on the front lines. And many of the initiatives that the Federal Transit Administration had already begun under the leadership of Administrator Dorn and her executive staff at the direction of our Secretary Mineta, really brought us to a five-part initiative. The five-point initiative, which includes the assessments, and we'll go through each one momentarily, but the assessments, planning, training, testing, and research. And this five-point initiative has progressed to where we are currently, and I'll go through each one. The first I'd like to discuss with you this morning is the readiness assessments at the top 36 transit agencies. Provided a threat and vulnerability analysis of our transit agencies in the country. And also we were very fortunate to have technical assistance from our counterparts in London, Paris, and Israel. Next is the planning initiative, this Connecting Community Regional Forums. These particular forums, I've had the opportunity to be in the field the last 6 months, traveling throughout our country, and actually working with our first responders, and our transit agencies. We have 17 cities that we will be visiting over the next year, which will be completed by February of 2003, where we are connecting the emergency service responders and our transit community to understand on both sides what the transit community brings to the table, as well as our emergency service providers in the communities. Because many times, many of the transit providers are not part of the table when that emergency operation plan is put together. And that's something that we learned very vividly in the New York and Washington area and in Somerset County in Pennsylvania, that the response was second to none. The emergency service community, along with the partnerships that have been forged with our transit community and our private motor coaches throughout, and our school buses throughout the country, that is where we are practicing that throughout the country. So many of the communities in our country and our transit agencies are partaking. As I mentioned last week, I was in Detroit with our administrator and our deputy secretary, Michael Jackson, where they kicked off the Detroit Forum. It also gives us an idea, an opportunity to provide technical assistance to the top 60 transit agencies, and also to provide input into the Office of Homeland Security threat level system. Security initiative testing. Testing is in the form of emergency drill grants. 82 of our transit agencies, top agencies in the country, have received $3.3 million. That's a total collective. Each one had the opportunity to apply for a $50,000 grant, which provided for that initiative of bringing the transit agency and the emergency service providers together to do full-scale drills and to practice that plan and to forge new relationships if a particular partner had not been part of that emergency operation plan. Security initiative training. Training is another important component of the five-part initiative, which there are two main components: the National Transit Institute. National Transit Institute at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. We have rolled out 2 additional brand new courses for our frontline employees. Frontline employees for the transit industry, for the transit employee and their supervisor. There are 2 modules that are brand new on the street. Security awareness and also awareness for the supervision. In addition, our Transportation Safety Institute, which is housed at the Oklahoma City Mike Maroney Center, we've updated 8 of our security courses. Many of the instructors for those courses come from the industry, from law enforcement, transit, security, who teach the respective agencies in the country our respective areas, whether it be in effectively managing transit emergencies or a WMD course. Research initiatives, chemical biodetection protection, also intelligent sharing coordination. We heard discussion of that this morning, and our ITS systems. These are all integrations. We are looking to share these types, whether it be through ISACs or through the FBI's InfraGard, with our partners in the country. And with that, I'd like to close in saying that the Federal Transit Administration is partnering with many of the different organizations in the country, because there are different groups that have many different missions, but together, and more importantly, together with our partners, we are able to accomplish the unity of the fact that we need to have a mobile and secure transit system in the country, and by working together, we can accomplish that. And again, I thank you for the opportunity on behalf of our administrator to speak with you this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Diamond. Our final speaker is a genuine expert in the field. I've had the pleasure of being on a panel with him before, and I know you'll find this talk interesting. Dr. Omen Omadvar is Program Manager and Technology Analyst in the Advanced Technology Program. He's working on areas of, this is at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. He's working on areas of biometric, pervasive computing, e-commerce, bioinformatics, and security. He joined ATP as the Technical Program Manager of Digital Video Programs. He was the Technical Director of the SPPARC Center, a supercomputing facility founded by the National Science Foundation. He has an undergraduate degree in Industrial Management and Engineering, an MS in Computer Engineering, and a PhD in Computer Science. He's also got an MBA from George Mason and is the author of more than 100 technical papers and 9 books. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Omi Omiko.
Well, I'm getting this. Thank you very much. I want to thank you, Bruce, Bill, and Equity International for this opportunity. Before I start saying anything else, I want to read from an article by David Rothkopf, who used to be Undersecretary of Commerce. Now he's a professor at Columbia University. Only one plant, and this article showed up in Foreign Policy magazine in June 2002. Only one kind of alliance can win the war on terrorism. And then he goes on, its best troops will be regiment of geeks rather than the special forces, which live on ration of cold pizzas and coffee, not MRE, for those of you who are not military meal ready to eat. The member of this fighting force are scientists, doctors, venture capitalists, corporate project manager, private sector army, that is United States not so secret weapon, and it is our best hope. So basically, technology is what is going to win this war. First of all, I want to say government at best can define the problems and can buy the solution which comes from private industry. And this war is going to be won by soldier of fortune 500 or 1,000, which I see very well represented in here. My agency is a very small agency, Advanced Technology Program. NIST has a dual role in here. We do fund some technologies outside, and we are sort of lead in the implementation of Patriot Act for measurement and a standard. The standard, I cannot make any promises. My former boss, when I was in the lab, Charles Wilson, is in charge of measurement for Patriot Act. And it is coming. In fact, Gary said it's going to show up at the beginning of November for some of the biometric stuff. With that, I would like to make an introduction about my home office, which is Advanced Technology Program. We don't do any research. We give money to private for-profit corporations to do the R&D, to do the research. We have invested money in different type of technologies, from a good hard plastic for truck bed liner to DNA chips. And basically, we have some investment in security technology as well. Our mission is to basically bridge the gap between the laboratory and marketplace and do commercialization of technology. We have been in existence for about 12 years. Basically, that's what we have done. We have received about 5,000 proposals asking for about $10 billion. We have funded about 581 projects, 185 joint ventures, 396 single applicants, 3.8 billion, 1.8 billion is ATP money, and about $2 billion is private money. 61% of our recipients are small business, so small businesses are doing very well. Over 150 universities are participants, and 25 national laboratories. This is sort of a competition which we held in 2002, which is also ongoing. It's not quite finished. So far, we have done 41 awards, 183 millions of ATP fund, 152 millions of industry fund, and the average award size is about 2.8 million. If you look at this chart, you see about more than 50% of our investment is in electronics and computer or information technology. The rest is in biotechnology, material, and manufacturing. All of these areas somehow relate to Homeland Security and defense. Homeland Security threat, probably I'm stating the obvious in here, but in risk of doing that, the threats are either nuclear, biological, agricultural, toxic chemical, explosive material, cyber warfare, and terrorist stuff. What are the vulnerabilities? Human population, energy system, transportation system, fixed infrastructure such as buildings and pipelines and so on and so forth. Cargo systems. I was in the National Academy of Sciences meeting. They said 60 million of them coming through every year. So if somebody is saying on a cargo it says banana from Iceland, we should worry about that, and there is a problem right there. So, and all of these combined are a threat to our economy. What are the solutions? Intelligence, surveillance, detection, diagnosis, prevention, response, and recovery. And in fact, in this panel, you see representation of response, recovery, prevention, diagnosis, and probably before I came here, somebody talked about intelligence and surveillance. Homeland Security Initiative, these are the ones that they are in the bill for Homeland Security. Create the smart borders. You have only 15 seconds to check somebody's ID to get into this country. So it has to be an efficient system which accommodates that kind of capability. Combat fraudulent travel documents, visas, passports. In fact, the problem we have faced at September 11 was the problem of human ID. We could not identify the people properly. That was one of the major problems. Increase security of shipping containers, I already explained. Intensify international law enforcement. Expand protection of infrastructure. If you look at any one of these initiatives, you notice you need some sort of intelligent solution to either do, instead of searching the fingerprint in a database of 100 million, taking 33 minutes, we need 33 seconds. So you see, there is a major challenge. Security technologies, what are they? What are we looking for? What type of technology we are looking for? The smart ID with biometrics. The smart IDs have been in use in Europe for several years. In fact, we think ID or human ID is going to be one of the applications for the smart card. Example, if you have to hold your card with your fingerprint, a live fingerprint, in order for the smart card to work, then you do not worry about the lost card. Because no matter what they do to it, they cannot get it activated, or in fact, for credit card, it would be another solution. Forensic DNA diagnostics, we do have investment in that area. In fact, we have invested about $200 million of money in DNA diagnostics. One of the major companies in this area is Affymetrix. It's a multi-billion-dollar company started with $2 million of alpha. Surveillance technologies, we have funded some of the surveillance technology, cubic defense, for those of you who are familiar with. And the idea in here is, instead of having an army of troops protecting a pipeline from here to Alaska, surveillance, a set of surveillance, small, cheap cameras can do that while the computer can do motion estimation and detect abnormal behavior, these type of motion. Blood fingerprinting, chemical detection chip, counterfeiting, technologies, survivability, and cyber security. These are the technologies we are looking for. Again, Gary talked about 3D face recognition. We already funded a company which is in Kensington, Maryland, which is doing the 3D face recognition. Multimodal biometric, IR imaging, these are the type of technologies we are looking for. Funding for technologies, NIH has $1.7 billion for biodefense. Department of Homeland Security has $500 million on accelerated R&D. There is a facility called SARPA, Security Advanced Research Project Agency in Homeland Security, and science and technology is a big part of this effort. These are the companies we have funded already, about $100 million in security technology, cross-match technology, surrogate blood, fingerprinting, interlab, physical optics, affymetrics, chemical and organic biosciences. What can ATP do for you? ATP Fund for-profit corporation, $2 million per project. These are only the two technological risks. We share the technological risk, not business risk. We need business plan. We not want to know how you can make money from it, because if you cannot make money from it, the chances are it's not going to go nowhere. And we are looking for poor technologies with high risk and high payoff. So BWT stands for big, weird things. So basically, the stuff that if they work tremendously. And here are my coordinates if you need to get in touch with me. I thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Omengar. We are under the tyranny of the clock, given the fact that this is being televised by C-SPAN. We have 5 or 6 minutes for Q&A. I just want to wrap up. We heard from Admiral Pluto about the new normalcy in terms of maritime security, balancing security interests with cargo and passenger mobility. From Gary Brill, we heard about the various kinds of biometric solutions that the FAA is undertaking, including, I guess, security at Super Bowls. Leonard Diamond talked about the FTA's DOT's 5-part initiative, assessment, planning, training, testing, and research. Dr. Omengar addressed the needs and the need to cooperate with the regime of geeks with the soldiers of Fortune 100, as well as the scope of NIST investment in technologies and the need to have commercial as well as good ideas. So at this point, I want to simply say that after 9/11, nothing will ever be the same in America. Nothing will ever be the same in terms of Homeland Security industries. This is a wholesale and complex change for a number of companies in totally different and interlinked and overlapping areas. And indeed, we are increasingly characterized as a sector of federal, state, and local government procurement, and we've only just seen the beginning. So I do commend Equity International for putting on this important seminar. I'm happy to take 1 or 2 questions. Please come to the mic and indicate who you are and what your question is.
I'm Laird with BA Systems North America. I was wondering if you might make a recommendation for industry at this point.
Anyone on the panel like to take that?
Sure. Capabilities for the companies who want to get together and form a joint venture to do things. For example, if a system integrator want to combine several technologies to provide the solution, we would facilitate that kind of activities.
Thank you. Just briefly, I apologize for not getting into more detail as far as what I project as some of the future needs of the Coast Guard, but they lie largely in information systems, both communications and data sharing, security of information, fusion of intelligence, integrating government and commercial information like in cargo transfer, interoperability with the other services, marinization of detection equipment for CBRN detection, as well as explosive detection. I mean, picture the petty officer climbing on board a vessel with a knapsack carrying a 20-pound thing. I mean, we need a portability type of and accessibility and personnel protection type detection, day-night surveillance capability, non-lethal weapons development, and exclusion barriers to protect security zones and anti-terrorism force protection for our troops.
Any other panel comment? Any other questions? Please come to the mic. Systems International. There's been a lot of talk in the past in regard to IDs for travelers to reduce the hassle, to increase revenue for the airlines and other businesses. Is that something that's still going on? Thank you.
Other than that, I really can't comment on that particular thing. It's extremely political right now. One thing that I do need to say that's not into that particular question, what I presented was a summary of what is going on in the market. FAA does not do Super Bowls. I wish we did. We'd probably be able to get tickets in that case. But the things that I presented, FAA is aware of them, especially those things dealing with transportation. But we're not directly involved with the majority of them. The airports are all independent municipalities and fund their own projects, or run their own projects. Often there's funding that comes in.
Thank you, Gary. We have 2 minutes left, and I apologize for any deficiencies of the moderator. Any other questions? I'm going to ask a question about WPUTA. Do you feel that the Coast Guard has an adequate budget for the next fiscal year, and to what extent are you operating in cooperation with the Customs Service and the Customs CTPAT program, what we call the Trusted Shipper Program?
Thank you. Your guess is as good as mine what the budget will hold for us. We're operating on a continuing resolution like most everyone else. We have high hopes, though, that with the administration's support and the Congress's support, that it'll help us along a multi-year strategy to get where we need to be. We're nowhere near where we need to be in order to do our traditional missions as well as maritime homeland security today. We're far better off than we were on 9/11, but it's going to take us at least 3 to 5 years in order to get the capability to do everything.
We have 1 minute left, and simply going to invite the panelists, anyone who wants to speak, to make a final comment. Len, any final words?
All of the panelists this morning have spoken to various modes and whatever, but we'll take all modes to work together in the spirit of environment where we are working together, whether, as I mentioned, the emergency service personnel, transit personnel, or private industry. So together, we can respond to those emergencies in our communities and provide that service the public desperately expects from us.
I will put it.
Thank you. I'm sorry not to address the question about the U.S. Customs Service. You know, we come from the same roots, and we have been working together forever, and we have been working together even more closely over the past year. We've developed a common strategy for border security with the Customs Service and with INS. I've taken members of the U.S. Customs Service on our U.S. delegation to the International Maritime Organization to negotiate maritime security, and we continue to work together even on a Border of the Future initiative to make sure that everything we're doing is compatible.
Thank you. Gary, any final comment?
I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of the pilot programs that Transportation Security Administration is going to be doing with the airports. I would expect them, the original schedule was to kick off pilots the end of December with the funding issues. I'm sure that has been delayed. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out. We have a lot of capability out there in the market, and this is another venue where we can see what will work in a real world situation versus what looks good in the marketing. So I'm excited to see that.
Thank you.
submit ideas. We would like, and in case if any of you want to form joint venture between several companies, we are willing to help. So, and you have my coordinates.
Now, a final comment. The Congress a year ago set some aggressive deadlines for the administration, particularly for TSA to meet, and yet TSA is still staffing up. It's obvious that a transition period is needed, and one of the things that our organization has done is to release some position papers that address an alternative to the status quo if these deadlines are not met. So we invite you to go to our website, look at them. I will say we are now at 59 minutes, so Bill, I think it's time for me to close, and thanks for having this event.
Many thanks to Bruce Aiken and our distinguished panelists for their outstanding presentations. Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta has stated, quote, "We are compelled to consider in a new way the importance of securing our national assets from those who wish to do harm through acts of violence. This is why the work of the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, is so important to all of us. Its mission is prevention. Working closely with the other operating administrations, TSA is charged with identifying and implementing changes in processes, systems, and behavior that will keep our transportation system secure," unquote. And so it's our honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Robert W. Gardner. Mr. Gardner is currently the Associate Undersecretary for Finance and Administration and Chief Financial Officer at the Transportation Security Administration. He assumed this position on March 25th of this year. Prior to this appointment, he served as the Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Budget at the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. He assumed that position on January 19th, 2000. Prior to this appointment, he served as the Director of the Restructuring Office for the INS, to which he was appointed in October 1998. And prior to that appointment, he was the Chief Financial Officer of the Veterans Benefits Administration in the Department of Veterans Affairs, a position to which he was appointed in August 1994. Please join me in welcoming TSA's Robert Gardner.
Good morning. Thank you. Appreciate that. Listen to that litany of where I've been and ask myself, where have I been? In a lot of different places, doing a lot of different things over my career. Mostly involved in financial management and budgeting across the federal government. What I'd like to do this morning is, in response to some guidance that Bill gave me, talk to you a little bit about our funding situation in TSA. It's a great opportunity to frankly stop from my perspective and reflect a little bit on where we've been. And although it's really only several months, as you heard, in terms of my time at TSA, it seems like several years. It's also, quite frankly, probably therapeutic for me to be able to share with you what's going on and process that a little bit to keep me somewhat sane, because it has been rather insane at times trying to do everything we've done over the last several months with TSA. I want to really do three things this morning. Review with you our fiscal 2002 and 2003 budgets a bit. Review the budget process for TSA. A lot of people say they know about the federal budget but don't always appreciate the federal budget as far as the way we live it. And then maybe offer some suggestions for your roles in all of this. I really can't discuss the whole Department of Homeland Security budget. That's a lot more agencies and a lot bigger set of issues beyond TSA. And of course, a lot of that is not yet certain, so really won't go beyond TSA's boundaries. I assume you're aware of what TSA's mission. I think Bill really summarized it very well. We are aiming and working very hard to secure the nation's transportation system. That's no small task, as we're all learning. We have some legislation which is very specific about parts of that mission, and other parts of the mission are left for us to do a lot of work and research and figure out the best way to do it. And that is what we are all aiming at. That is what all of us in TSA are focusing our efforts on these days. Let me then start with a review of, as I said, our 02 and 03 budgets. Our current budget situation I'll talk about as well as far as operating under continuing resolution. But the year that we just completed on September 30th, the fiscal 02 period, and that really includes a little bit of 01 money as well that goes back before last fiscal year. We received really just over about $5.8 billion worth of funds, including a little bit of money that came to us before the fiscal year started a year ago, October 1. Those funds came from over 20 different sources and transactions. And I don't say that because that's a fascinating bureaucratic point. I say that because I want to share with you some of the challenges that have been a part of just getting that money and using it and keeping track of it. The largest amount of those amounts was about $3.85 billion, which was passed in August, just this August of this year, and the smallest was $1.5 million in a separate account passed almost a year ago this fall. So you can see there's a wide range of funding. Much of those 20 accounts and transactions were earmarked for very specific purposes, which in my world of financing and budget means you don't have a lot of flexibility. So when somebody pops up and says, hey, we got this new idea, or hey, we need to shift this over here, you can't just take $5.8 billion and say, well, let's shove a couple $100 million over here, let's move this over here. You have to do it within pretty strict requirements from a flexibility standpoint. And we understand the other side of that. Of course, people want us to use money for certain things to get certain things done. So there's two sides of that whole issue. We do have to track all of those different amounts of appropriations very carefully and report on them and keep track of them through a new system that was being set up. I would just pause for a second and say one of the things I certainly knew that I was coming into a new organization and setting up a new organization. That's one of the reasons I took the job. But probably what I didn't anticipate fully enough was the whole issue of startup and financial systems and financial tracking and doing that well. I certainly had a lot of ideas about how I wanted to do it differently and do it very well and kind of take the next step in terms of federal accounting and financial management. But setting all that up and having all that agenda and having the time to focus on that at the same time, getting money and then getting money spent and obligated and tracked in terms of specific uses are two major efforts that both deserve more time and individually deserve more time than we really had, and we're playing a lot of catch-up there. But this many accounts is not, I hope you understand, the normal situation that federal agencies have, even in INS where I was before TSA, which has an interesting tortured financial history. They have much fewer than that many appropriations in a normal year, and certainly TSA's experience is unique given the congressional response after September 11th of last year and the change that's gone on. But it has created a huge challenge in terms of just getting the money and keeping track of it. It's important to mention that we also collect fees in TSA. We collected over about $1.1 billion in fiscal 02, and the idea, of course, behind those fees is to offset part of those costs, that $5.8 billion we received. The biggest portion of those fees is from the $2.50 passenger fee that everybody pays. It's per employment, so you pay it if you have a couple of legs, you may pay $5. I think it's no more than $10 on a round trip. And that has raised really beyond our expectations. Whether it's a matter of the projections from FAA being exceeded in terms of the rebound from the traveler, or the differences in terms of projecting those separate legs of the trip, the projections and the amount of revenue that came in was above our projections that we had initially. The second fee is the air carrier and infrastructure fee, which is a complicated fee I won't spend a lot of time on, but it's a fee that was put into the act that the airlines pay us that was reflective of the cost they were devoting to security. And we have not received what we anticipated there. We're sort of involved in an texting back and forth with the airlines over what that fee ultimately will be. And I could spend the rest of my time talking with you about that, but won't do that. The interesting thing about the fees in general that I'd share with you is that comes down to what Congress really intends with TSA. Who's going to pay the bill? And how much is going to be really paid by the traveling public versus the taxpayer. And right now, as you can see, the swing is pretty much being paid by the taxpayer because we're collecting, at least in 2002, about a little over $1 billion in fees, and we are spending about 4 to 5 times that amount. What do we use those funds for then? That's sort of shared with you. Here's where they came from. What do we use it for in 2002? We spent about $1 billion last week, but we received about $5.8 billion. We spent about $4.8 billion because we didn't have all those necessary things ready to go. So we carried some over. The funds are available for more than 1 year. We spent about $4.8 billion, and we carried $1 billion into 2003, and I'll talk about that in a second. And that for a special reason that was why it was carried over. $1.3 billion of that $4.8 billion went for private screener contracts. If you know the act and if you follow it, and if you're excited about those types of things and keep track of it, a big part of the legislation was that the federal government picked up not only the ultimate responsibility for screening at checkpoints, but the immediate responsibility in February of this year. And so on February 17th, we actually assumed a lot of those contracts and paid for those contracts. So about $1.3 billion has been devoted to paying for those private contractors that have been doing the security at the checkpoints and have been phased down as we hire federal employees and replace them and change that operation. So that's a very large amount of money that we have used in fiscal 2002 to support that at 430 airports. The oversight of those contracts has been a challenge because we picked them up and they range from very large security firms that you may be familiar with to very small ones at very small airports in a different operation and a very different type of arrangement in terms of oversight compared to what a federal agency would normally necessarily be doing as far as keeping track of costs and auditing them. In addition to that amount, we spent about $1.1 billion to purchase explosive detection systems and other types of equipment related to the baggage screening. That's a big part of our mandate, and of course the deadline on that is the end of this calendar year, December 31st, where the deadline for the passenger checkpoints is the 19th of November. We do, under the Act, need to have some sort of explosive detection system at all of the airports, so we spent these funds to buy over about 1,100 of the explosive detection systems machines and well over 4,000 different ETD machines, it's called, the trace machines. And it's far more complicated than I have the time or knowledge to get into now, but that consumed a large amount of our budgets and is aimed again at the 12/31 deadline and gets involved in how they're being installed and a lot of the work there. As I think probably a lot of you know, Boeing is doing that work for us in terms of helping us with that installation and design. I think we've got representatives from Boeing here, and we do appreciate that help and are working very closely with our partners there. Then we have about $1.2 billion additional we spent on really staff costs, and that consists of hiring, not all done, but hiring roughly 55,000 screeners, somewhere around 33,000 passenger checkpoint screeners, and an additional 22,000 baggage screeners. And those numbers are constantly changing as we learn a little bit more about how many we need in particular areas. That also includes funds to support those people in the airports. Where you have a large airport, you're going to need a support staff of 20 or 30 people in the airport with a federal security director to handle a couple of thousand or 1,500 screeners. And it's people to do that. Those funds include not just the salaries, but a really small amount because we're just getting that going in 2002, but the recruitment and training. The Act requires 40 hours of training before a screener goes to the checkpoint, and then 60 hours more, I believe, maybe a little bit more, of training on the job. And so there's 100-plus hours of training that we have done. Lockheed has been very helpful to us in that training area, and we appreciate that work and have devoted a lot of time and energy to do that. We, of course, are staffing up in TSA as an organization, and we have spent some funds on that, contracts as well as payroll to do a lot of that. Then there's been about $600 million for checkpoint improvements. Again, Lockheed has helped us with that using our pilot that we had at the Baltimore Washington Airport and other actual experience we have made an effort to improve the actual efficiency and effectiveness of checkpoint operations so that we are redesigning and reconfiguring them as we move along. Again, focused on that November 19th deadline. The rest of the money really breaks down into small amounts of money, research and development funds, state and local reimbursement, and National Guard reimbursement for law enforcement. Some other grants in non-aviation areas. We received just about $100 million in grants for port security and other areas, but those are sort of large chunks from the year that's just ended. Where are we for 03? Our pending request is for $5.3 billion. We also have, as I said, a $1 billion carryover, meaning we really hope to expend about $6.3 billion from October 1 that just before us through the next September. It's an ambitious, certainly goal. Of that amount, and I won't repeat a lot of what I said, but it sort of falls into some of the same categories. $2 billion will support the passenger screener operation. Now, you remember in 03, we got these people hired. We got to simply pay them and support that operation. So you're shifting from equipment and startup and a lot of contracted costs to really payroll and related costs. Just under $2 billion again to support the baggage screener operation. A lot of those installation costs are a part of that carryover money that moves into 03. And then we've got to pay those 20,000 plus baggage screeners and get that operation going. A big part that will grow very much in 03 is at the law enforcement side, $1.5 billion to support law enforcement at airports and on aircrafts, our federal air marshal program, which is up and running, plus that airport support staff that I mentioned. So there's a lot of things in that $1.5 billion there that are just getting going in the current year, and will be at full staffing and support in 03. And then again, the rest of that money is about a little bit less than $1 billion that's left over, and there's a large amounts in terms of research, the non-aviation area. State and local reimbursement is roughly, for law enforcement, it's probably going to run us $250 million. Where are we with Congress on that? The Senate Appropriations Committee in July gave us a mark of about $4.95 billion, but that didn't include at the time a $500 million supplemental. So that 4.95 really doesn't compare fairly with the 5.3, because at the time our request was 4.8, and they actually gave us 150 more. If we assume they would give us the $500 million we asked for, that 4.95 would actually be a little bit over the President's request. The House Appropriations Committee just last month gave us about $5.1 billion, made several different changes in their version of the Appropriation Act that, when you netted it all together, would be about a $200 million decrease. And of course, we have to see what happens when the Congress returns in the early part of November. The impact of the continuing resolution, I assume you understand the wonderful, fascinating intricacies of the federal continuing resolution that gives us money to continue even though we don't have a regular appropriation. We're at the equivalent of about $4.9 billion under the current continuing resolution. Our continuing resolution in a classroom would be a wonderful experience for students to learn how the government works, but for us to have to live with it, it's been very challenging to try to figure out what pots of money it's based on and how it continually supports a certain level of funding. That means ultimately they're about $500 million short in the President's request for the current year, and so we have to really make those adjustments and come up with, in essence, a tentative set of $500 million in cuts until we receive news to the otherwise or some sort of action. And we're working on that really now. We're in the really fourth continuing resolution. We had 3 that went for a week, as you may know, and then the one last week that gets us through November 22nd. And it is a challenge to be under weekly and small amounts of money, because you break it into proportions, and if you're a contractor, as you know, we have to cut it up into pieces, and we say to somebody, gee, we'd really appreciate it if you just sort of work with us on this, but you can only say that so long. And I would say here publicly, in terms of all our contracts, certainly Boeing and Lockheed, those of you that hear that, I appreciate your patience and toleration as we have had to work cash flow and work issues with our budget through the difficult time. And some of you may be familiar with that in other agencies, but I have never been under the stress of trying to work within a time constraint and a certain amount of monies that we've had. We are trying to protect very much the November 19th and December 31st deadline-related operations so that we can continue to secure funding for those and use it and not miss those. We do need action as soon as possible. When people say the hardest question, which is the simplest question, is, well, what happens on this date if you don't have money? Well, it depends on what part of the agency. And there's always a, well, what if we did this, what if we did this? This gets back to that flexibility I mentioned in terms of being able to move money around. And who you irritate when you do that in the wrong way. The worst thing would be that we continue, of course, at this level indefinitely, which means that $500 million in cuts would have to be made permanent, and we'd have to make some pretty tough decisions, and we're working, as I say, through that right now. So that gives you a rough sense of where we are in terms of the two budgets. Let me just say quickly that our budget process, we have to really go through three major levels. As you probably know, the Department of Transportation, working with the Office of Management and Budget and the White House, and then, of course, the Congress. And without spending a lot of time, each of them certainly has a level within itself. Within the Department of Transportation, we work with the CFO there and work with the Deputy and the Secretary. O&D has different branches and divisions and their own leadership. The White House includes the Office of Homeland Security and perhaps others, depending on the issue. Congress, of course, we have two subcommittees on appropriations, but they also get involved. We also get involved with the authorizing committee that actually created the act. And very interested in what's going on. The budget committees are talking with us. Other committees may get involved. We've had contact from government and reform and other committees. Other players, our own Inspector General, the General Accounting Office, FAA certainly is very involved in these matters within DOT, the Coast Guard, other Homeland Security-related agencies. Oversight, I would say, this gets into perhaps the therapeutic point I mentioned. Oversight is big business in this town, and at any given time, I feel like if there's 10 people involved with TSA, 8 or 9 of them are asking what we're doing, and the other 2 are doing it. And I kind of say, could I have it maybe reversed sometime so that we got 8 people to do it and maybe 2 people to talk about how we're doing on it? Because that really is, it's a lot about telling somebody what's happening rather than getting it done. And I understand that. I understand why that is. I've been a part of those oversight agencies certainly over my career. But it's doing, one of the reasons I'm in this job is that at a certain point, you've got to get into the barrel, you've got to do it. And this mission is about as good an example as we'll ever have in the federal government, about kind of stepping forward from a public service standpoint and doing it and getting it done well and saying, I did that because I am a public servant, I am proud of that, and I want to serve the taxpayer and the customer and the traveler and everybody else. And that's why sometimes it gets frustrating when you got everybody saying, how you doing? And couldn't you do it a little quicker or something like that? Let me just conclude by offering you some suggestions. We do want to use private contractors. I think that's pretty obvious. But I say that as a 25-year-plus federal bureaucrat and all the whatever connotations you have. I have had wonderful success in using private contractors to achieve things. We are not federal bureaucrats devoted to building huge empires of federal employees and all that sort of thing. We really certainly know the value. I would identify very much with what was just said in terms of the ideas and the creativity that are out there in the private sector, and we welcome and want that. It is very much a partnership. Admiral Lloyd, who is our acting undersecretary, has stressed to us, all of us, as executives, that it is about the partnership, and we take that very seriously. I have achieved very much, as I said in my career, with some very competent private sector partners, and I look forward to doing that at TSA. We know that you want to help. We know that many of you are aggressive in that regard and very much committed to our mission as well. I am inspired and struck by a lot of the stories from a lot of the private sector companies who have direct experience in the security area and want to be a part of what TSA is doing. I believe we have a great team at TSA. These are tough times, and many of us have probably been frustrated and never seen anything as difficult as this. But I will tell you that over my career, and I have, as you heard, moved around a lot of agencies, I have never served with a more competent set of executives and professional staff than are at TSA right now. We have great leadership. Admiral Lloyd gets that leadership thing in terms of setting goals and talking to us about them and making sure that we are constantly focused on it. It's an often used phrase, but that line about the main things to keep the main thing is very much real at TSA in terms of reminding us what it's about. And so we are working very hard about that. It's just hard in this this environment to get it done under an uncertain funding situation, under differences of opinion about how to do it and how many people to hire and the pace at which to do all this and the strategy to use. We are open to creative new ways of doing things. I don't believe, and certainly as a financial manager, I am not at all stuck in the past. As an example, I would share with you both at INS and at the VA, I used contractors to do some very creative cost work, activity-based costing, that put in the hands of the managers wonderful new tools to do a better job that went beyond just the cost aspect. It opened up a lot of opportunities for them, and they realized that these are wonderful tools. This was certainly something that could never have been done with the staff that we have, but it was very much something that people got excited about, the existing staff got excited about, and took a hold of, and really became very, very useful to us. I would ask that you work with us as much as possible. Remember, our perspective is different. If we all appreciate each other's perspective, we'll make it through each day. That's something that we have to remember. I get a lot of phone calls from contractors. I can't return probably many of them because I don't have the time to do that. And I hope you realize that if I don't return your calls, it's because I'm trying to get the money so that somebody sometime will return your calls. And that's very much what it's a part of. I would encourage you to keep your eye out for our acquisitions as they are announced and those type of procurement efforts, as you are very much aware of, and that's probably the best way to pursue things. I do think we're doing great things in TSA, and that's why I continue to be positive and upbeat. I would say that already we received 10 to 15 compliments to complaints from the airports in just the 150, I think it's up to 180, 190 airports we federalized. So the good results are coming, but we are not satisfied with that. As Admiral Roy has said, terrorists only have to get it right once, but we have to get it right every single time, and we remember that every single day and work hard at that. So I would conclude by saying I look forward to working with you, certainly as representatives and everyone in the private sector, and hope that all of us will work together in that regard to protect the traveling public and ultimately get beyond this difficult time in our country. Thank you.
Outstanding keynote presentation. We have time for a couple of questions before we adjourn. Come to the mic and identify yourself, please.
Could you comment on the pilot programs that TSA has undertaken?
There's a lot of different pilots. I guess I'm not sure necessarily which ones you mean. I know there's a lot of different. The airport pilots that were just mentioned earlier. Yeah, I don't know a lot of details about those. I know that those have been, those are part of the act, I believe, specified, and there are plans underway. Again, from a funding standpoint, we've got to make sure that we've got that covered. And I got to be honest with you, I'm not up on in terms of the timing and actual process to get those rolling. I know that those have been under discussion and planning, but I don't have, at least in my mind, a recent set of where we are on that and exactly the dollars and timing on those. I apologize. There's a lot of pilot efforts going on in TSA.
There's no question. I guess you answered all the questions. Thank you. Thank you very much for speaking. Thank you very much again, Mr. Gardner, for your outstanding keynote presentation and for taking the time to be with us here today. We thank all of the corporate executives here for attending today's Homeland Security Financing briefing, and we especially thank all of our outstanding speakers and moderators. Equity International invites you to join us again on November 18th and December 16th for our next Homeland Security Financing briefings. And please join us at the Homeland and Global Security Summit, March 3rd through 5th, 2003, at the Washington Convention Center in Washington, D.C. Our website, again, for these events is www.globalsecurity.bz. Our phone number is 202-756